at 11:57 p.m. on my daughter's 7th birthday, my neighbor called while I was thousands of miles away on business. Her voice was shaking. "Lauren, your parents aren't here. Ava says they left this morning." Then she looked outside and said the sentence I still hear in my sleep. "She's been sitting on this bench since 2 p.m. My parents were supposed to be celebrating with her. Instead, they were on a Carnival cruise to the Bahamas with my sister and her kids. I booked the first flight home, and before their cruise ended, I learned why they needed my daughter to be found alone. If you've ever trusted someone with the person you love most, stay with me." For 1 second, I thought Carol had called the wrong Lauren. I was standing barefoot on hotel carpet in Frankfurt, one hand still resting on the lid of my laptop, the city outside my window just beginning to pale toward morning. My presentation notes were open. A half-finished cup of coffee sat beside them. 5 minutes earlier, I had been worrying about whether a supplier meeting would run long. Then Carol said my 7-year-old was sitting outside our house in Florida near midnight, and the room seemed to narrow around me. I pressed the phone harder against my ear. "Put her inside. Please, don't leave her out there." Carol told me she already had her by the hand and was walking her across the yard. I heard the front door close, the scrape of a lock, then Ava's small voice somewhere close to the phone. That sound did something to my body before my mind could catch up. My knees went weak. I sat down on the edge of the bed without remembering deciding to move. Carol had lived across from us for 9 years. She had watched Ava learn to ride a bike, had watered my plants after Ethan died, had once driven me to urgent care when I was too stubborn to admit a kidney stone was not going to negotiate with me. If Carol said there was no adult at my house, there was no adult at my house. I asked her to check every room anyway. She did, moving through my place while keeping me on speaker. The living room lights were off. My parents' overnight bag was gone from the guest room. Their car was gone from the driveway. The kitchen looked as if breakfast had been made and then abandoned. Ava's birthday cake sat unopened in the refrigerator. No note, no sitter, no grandparent. Carol's voice hardened in that quiet way older women sometimes have when anger has burned past surprise. "Lauren." She was alone. I asked to talk to Ava. "Mom?" Ava sounded sleepy, not hysterical. That scared me more. "I'm here, baby. You're with Miss Carol now. You're safe." There was a pause, then the question that still makes my chest tighten when I remember it. "Are you mad?" "No. No, sweetheart. I'm not mad at you. Not even a little." "Okay." I could hear fabric rustling as Carol wrapped something around her, probably the old blue throw she kept on the back of her couch. I asked Ava whether she was hurt, whether she had fallen, whether anyone had come to the house. Her answers came in short pieces. No one came. She had gone inside sometimes for water and to use the bathroom, but she kept going back to the porch because Grandma said she had to wait there. I almost asked why she had not called me, then stopped myself. Ava did not have a phone. I had never bought her one, because she was 7. We did not have a landline. Her school tablet was locked down to school apps, and she had been told an adult was coming any minute. In her mind, leaving the porch to find help meant risking missing the person she had been told to wait for. The fact that she had obeyed so completely made me feel sick. Carol told me she was calling the local non-emergency line, so there would be a record that a child had been found without a caregiver, and I told her yes before she finished the sentence. I did not want a debate about procedure. I wanted another adult in Florida to know Ava was safe, and another set of eyes to confirm what Carol had found. While Carol handled that, I opened the airline app with shaking fingers. Frankfurt to Orlando. The first route I could physically make. I typed in the dates wrong twice. My company had a morning session I was supposed to lead, followed by a supplier review that had taken 3 months to schedule. None of it mattered in the way it had mattered 10 minutes earlier. I messaged my deputy, told him there was a family emergency and he would need to take the presentation, then called the travel desk and told them I was leaving. I did not ask what it would cost. I did not ask whether my manager would be angry. There are moments when every part of your life suddenly sorts itself into what can wait and what cannot. My daughter could not. That was when I saw the birthday card propped beside my passport. I had bought it in the airport gift shop 2 days earlier because I had hated leaving without one more thing to bring home. The front had a ridiculous cartoon llama wearing a paper crown, exactly the kind of thing Ava found funny. Tucked behind it was the picture she had sent me that morning. 2 missing front teeth, pink pajamas, and 7 fingers held up because she had needed both hands and still somehow gotten the count wrong in the first picture. I stared at that photo and remembered the argument I had had with myself 10 days before the trip. I had almost turned Frankfurt down. It was not a vacation. It was a week of supplier meetings, a facility review, and the kind of presentation that could not easily be handed to someone else. But it was also Ava's birthday, and since Ethan died, I had become suspicious of every professional choice that took me away from her, as if widowhood had turned every airplane ticket into a moral test. My mother had been the one who ended the debate. I had texted her that I might decline the trip because I did not want Ava spending her birthday feeling passed around. Diane replied almost immediately, "Leave her with us. We've got her." Dad followed with a thumbs up and a message about pancakes in the morning and pizza that night. Mom said she would make the day special. Ava had been delighted when I told her. Grandma had promised birthday pancakes with strawberries cut like hearts, a trip to pick out a small present, and cake after dinner. I had arranged video calls around the time difference. I had left money, medical information, school details, the spare house key, everything I always left when my parents stayed with her. I had not handed my child to strangers. I had handed her to the 2 people who had spent years telling me I was lucky to have family close by. After Ethan died, that trust had not been abstract. My parents had been the people who filled the spaces I could not. Dad picked Ava up from kindergarten when a flight was delayed. Mom learned which cereal Ava would actually eat, and which socks made her complain about the seams. They knew the alarm code, where I kept the spare key, which pediatrician I used, how to braid Ava's hair badly enough that she laughed about it instead of getting upset. I had never treated them like occasional babysitters. I had treated them like family, in the oldest sense of the word. The people you could call before you had finished explaining the problem. When colleagues asked how I managed international travel as a widowed mother, I always said the same thing. I had help. I said it with gratitude. I said it without embarrassment. I had never imagined that one day those same words might feel like an accusation. Ava adored them for reasons that had nothing to do with convenience. She saved the red gummy candies from mixed bags because Grandpa liked them. She drew Grandma into every family picture even when Grandma was not there. The week before my trip, she had spent 20 minutes deciding whether 7 candles meant she was a big kid now, or whether 8 was the real big kid number, because 8 sounded more serious. Mom had laughed and told her 7 was plenty serious. That was why I had believed the birthday would be safe in their hands, not merely supervised. Loved. That memory lasted maybe 30 seconds before rage crowded it out. I called my mother. She did not answer. I called my father. No answer. I called again, then opened the family group chat, and saw the photo I had ignored earlier because I had been in meetings. Amanda had posted it that afternoon. My sister stood between our parents on the deck of a cruise ship, wind blowing her hair across her sunglasses, Mason leaning against Dad, and little Peyton holding a plastic cup with both hands. Behind them was blue water and a white railing. The caption said, "Bahamas, here we come." I stared at the picture until I could make myself understand what I was seeing. My parents had not gone out for dinner. They had not driven home to grab something. They had not been delayed by a flat tire or an emergency. They had boarded Carnival Freedom at Port Canaveral with my sister and her 2 children, while my daughter waited on our porch for someone to come get her. My father finally called back. The first thing I heard was music and voices. Not panic, not an airport announcement. Music. Somewhere behind him, someone laughed. "Lauren," he said, already sounding tired of the conversation. "We're trying to figure out what happened. What happened is Ava is at Carol's house because nobody is at mine. There was supposed to be someone there." The sentence was so strange that I went completely still. "Someone who?" He hesitated. I heard my mother's voice in the background asking for the phone. Dad said there had been a change in plans and that they understood I had arranged someone to take over in the afternoon. He kept using words like mix-up and handoff, calm words, office words, words that made it sound as though somebody had misplaced a delivery window instead of a 7-year-old child. I asked him to tell me the sitter's name. He could not. Mom came on. Her voice had that careful brightness she used when she thought a situation could still be managed if everybody stopped being emotional. "Lauren, this is obviously awful, but you said you had backup." I said, "What?" "You changed the plan after we told you we could cover the first part of the day." "No, I didn't." "You did. You said somebody would come around too." I looked at the picture of Ava on my phone, 7 fingers in the air, pink pajamas, trusting smile. "What sitter, Mom?" She exhaled sharply. "I don't remember the woman's name. You arranged her." "I arranged no one." "Well, then something got crossed somewhere." Behind her I could hear a door slide shut and the noise from the ship dim. For the first time since Carol called me, I noticed what neither of my parents had asked. They had not asked whether Ava had eaten. They had not asked whether she was hurt. They had not asked how long Carol thought she had been outside. They were focused on whose arrangement had failed, whose backup had not appeared, whose responsibility this was supposed to be. I said, "You told me you had her." "We did have her," Mom said, "until the plan changed." "What plan?" "Lauren, you are in Germany. We cannot do this while you're shouting." I was not shouting. My voice had gone so quiet I barely recognized it. Dad took the phone back and said, we all needed to calm down until they could sort through what had been said. He reminded me they had watched Ava many times while I traveled. He said that was exactly why this kind of confusion could happen when there were multiple schedules involved. Then he said something that landed wrong, though I could not yet explain why. "You left the country believing there was coverage." Not, "We left Ava." Not, "We should never have walked out of that house." You left the country. The shame I had carried since Carol's call moved closer to the surface. For one terrible second, it worked. I pictured myself wheeling a suitcase through Orlando International 2 days earlier, while Ava waved from between my parents. I remembered kissing her forehead, telling her I would call after breakfast, promising we would celebrate again when I got home. Maybe I had missed something. Maybe I had skimmed a message between meetings. Maybe grief and work and single motherhood had finally created the kind of mistake I had spent 3 years terrified of making. That is the cruelty of guilt. It will accept evidence that has not even been offered yet. Then I looked at the clock and heard Carol in the background asking Ava if she wanted toast. My child had been alone for hours. Whatever confusion existed among adults, nobody had physically checked that another adult had taken over before leaving for a cruise. That fact cut through everything else. "I'm coming home," I said. Mom started to say they would talk when they got back, as if their return 5 days later belonged in the same category as mine. I ended the call. The next hour blurred into logistics. My colleague took my presentation deck. The hotel printed my boarding pass because my hands would not stop trembling long enough to find the right attachment. I packed without folding anything. Laptop, charger, passport, Ava's llama card, one shoe in the wrong side of the suitcase. I left behind a blouse hanging in the closet and did not notice until much later. In the elevator, I caught sight of myself in the mirrored wall and barely recognized the woman staring back. I had spent most of my adult life being the person who handled things. My mother called me her easy daughter. At work, I was the person sent into broken systems because I could stay calm while everyone else panicked. After Ethan died, people praised me for how well I kept everything moving. Bills, school, grief counseling, insurance forms, dinner, work, bedtime. I had accepted every version of "you're so strong" as if strength were a compliment that did not come with a bill. That morning in Frankfurt, I did not feel strong. I felt like a mother who had trusted the wrong people. At the airport, Carol called again. A deputy had come and gone, after confirming Ava was safe with her and taking basic information. There would be follow-up. Carol kept the details brief because she knew I was moving through security, and I was grateful. Then she lowered her voice and told me something small enough that another person might have missed it. Ava had a little bag with her on the bench. What bag? One of those paper gift bags. Yellow tissue paper. She kept it beside her the whole time. I stopped near the end of the security line. Why? She said it was for your parents. The airport around me kept moving. Wheels clicked over tile. A baby cried somewhere behind me. A man argued with an airline employee about a connection. I closed my eyes. Ava had spent her birthday waiting outside with a gift for the people who had left her. Carol said she had asked Ava why she kept going back to the same exact place instead of staying inside once it got dark. Ava told her she had to be where the sitter could see her. Carol had assumed Ava meant something I had arranged. I asked, who told her to wait there? There was a short silence. Carol did not embellish it. Ava says your mother did. I moved out of the security line and leaned against a wall. The first time Carol told me Ava had been on the bench since 2, I had pictured a lonely child making a lonely decision. Maybe she had gone outside because she heard a car. Maybe she had thought her grandparents were coming back. Maybe she had wanted to be found. This was different. Someone had told her where to sit. Someone had told her when to sit there. My phone buzzed with a message from the airline confirming the Frankfurt to Orlando route. Boarding would begin soon. I looked at the screen, then at the family group chat, where the cruise photo still sat beneath birthday wishes to Ava from that morning, as if those two things belonged in the same family. Before I put my phone away, I sent one message to my parents. What was the name of the person you believed was coming for Ava at 2? Neither answered. I walked to the gate, with one question replacing all the others. I was still furious about the cruise. I was still terrified about what those hours alone had done to my daughter. I was still ashamed that I had been an ocean away. But underneath all of that, something colder had begun to form. If my mother truly believed another caregiver was coming, why had she needed to tell a 7-year-old exactly where to wait to be found? When my boarding group was called, I got on the first flight home. And as I took my seat, buckled the belt, and watched Frankfurt disappear behind the rain-streaked glass, I stopped asking who had forgotten my daughter. I started asking something else. Who was supposed to find her? By the time I landed in Orlando, I had been awake long enough for every thought to start feeling sharp around the edges. The cabin doors opened into a wall of Florida heat, even though it was already evening, and I moved through the airport with one hand on my suitcase and the other wrapped around my phone. Carol had sent updates while I was in the air. Ava had slept for a few hours. She had eaten toast, half a banana, and later some macaroni Carol found in her freezer. A deputy had stopped by, confirmed that Ava was safe, and taken the basic information. Someone from child welfare had called Carol and told her there would be follow-up because a 7-year-old had been found without an adult caregiver. Every message should have reassured me. Instead, each one made the distance between what should have happened and what had happened feel more real. My parents had been entrusted with my daughter. They had boarded a ship. Other people were now documenting the space they left behind. I did not go home first. I drove straight to Carol's. My body wanted a shower, food, a bed, 10 uninterrupted hours of sleep. I wanted my daughter more. Carol opened the door before I knocked. She looked older than she had 48 hours earlier, though I knew that was impossible. Worry does that to faces. She stepped aside, and I saw Ava curled on the couch, under the same blue throw I had pictured in Frankfurt. Her hair was tangled on one side. Someone had found one of Carol's old t-shirts for her to sleep in, and it hung almost to her knees. On the coffee table sat the little yellow gift bag with the crumpled tissue paper. It was the first thing my eyes went to after her face. Ava woke when I knelt beside the couch. She stared at me for one confused second, then threw both arms around my neck so hard her forehead hit my shoulder. I held her tighter. I had imagined that moment through the entire flight, dramatic tears, questions, anger, some visible release that would prove she understood how wrong the day had been. Instead, she pressed her face against me and whispered, "I'm sorry. I made everybody worried." That sentence hurt more than crying would have. I pulled back enough to look at her. "You didn't make anybody worried. Grown-ups made mistakes. You did not." She searched my face like she was checking whether I meant it, then said, "Grandma said I had to stay where the lady could see me." I wanted answers immediately. I also knew better than to turn my child into a witness before she had even had breakfast with me. So I did not ask 10 questions. I asked if she wanted to go home. She nodded, then looked toward Carol and asked if Carol could come too. Carol told her she would help us carry everything across the street. Ava took my hand and did not let go. Our house still smelled faintly like the vanilla candle my mother liked to burn when she stayed over. That normal detail nearly broke me. The kitchen counter had paper plates with gold stars stacked beside unopened napkins. A plastic number 7 leaned against the backsplash. The heart-shaped strawberries Mom had promised were in a container in the refrigerator, already drying at the edges. The cake was there too, white frosting with pink flowers and AVA written in purple. There were ordinary signs everywhere that someone had planned to celebrate a child. The fact that my parents had done some of the work before walking away made the whole thing harder to understand, not easier. I put Ava in my bed that night because neither of us pretended she wanted to sleep alone. She showered while I sat on the bathroom floor outside the curtain and listened to her explain, in the strange, sideways way children do, that Carol's guest room had a clock that ticked too loudly. She complained about shampoo in her eyes. She asked if the cake was still good. She wanted to know whether Mason and Peyton were seeing dolphins. The cruise had not become evidence to her. It was still the place her cousins had gone. The next morning, after cereal and half a slice of birthday cake because I had stopped caring what foods belonged at breakfast, I let her tell me the day in her own order. I kept my phone face down, no recording, no leading questions. Just me, Ava, and the kitchen table. Grandma and Grandpa had made pancakes in the morning. Ava remembered that because Grandpa burned the first one and called it the practice pancake. They gave her a small bracelet and let her open one present. Then, sometime before lunch, they began moving quickly. Grandpa took suitcases to the car. Grandma changed clothes and kept checking the time. Ava asked where they were going. Grandma told her they had an appointment and that Mom's new sitter would be there later. I asked Ava what the sitter's name was. She shrugged. Grandma just said the lady. When I asked whether Grandma had said I picked her, Ava gave another shrug, then nodded. She said you made a new plan. That was all. No description, no name, no memory of me talking about a new adult. Ava had accepted it because Grandma said it, and Grandma was one of the adults who always knew the plan. When I asked what happened after they left, Ava said Grandma let her watch television until almost 2. Then she had to go sit out front because the lady might not know our house. The porch bench sat under the covered part of our front entry, shaded from direct sun but visible from the sidewalk and from Carol's side of the street. I had bought it 2 years earlier because Ethan used to complain that every house needed somewhere to sit before you went inside. Until that week, it had been a place for backpacks, grocery bags, and damp towels after sprinkler fights. Now, I pictured my 7-year-old sitting there because an adult had told her that was where she would be found. "What time did Grandma say to go out?" I asked. 2. When I asked if she was sure, Ava frowned at me. Because the long hand was at the top and the little hand was at the 2. I stopped asking after that. She knew what she had been told. She said she went outside a little before 2 because she did not want the sitter to arrive first. The air was hot. She had brought the yellow gift bag because Grandma and Grandpa were supposed to come back later, and she wanted to give it to them before cake. When nobody came, she went inside for water. Then she returned to the bench. Later she used the bathroom. Returned again. She watched a lizard run across the walkway. She counted red cars. She moved the gift bag farther into the shade when she worried the tissue paper would fade. Sometime after dark, she turned on the porch light because she thought the sitter might have trouble seeing the number on our house. The details were so ordinary that each one felt worse than a dramatic story would have. There was no moment when she decided she had been abandoned. There were only small decisions made by a child who believed adults eventually did what they promised. I asked whether she had thought about going to a neighbor. Grandma said not to leave because the lady was coming. I asked about calling someone, and she looked at me as if I had forgotten the obvious. I don't have a phone. She said it without accusation. It was simply a fact. We had no landline. Her school tablet could not make normal calls. She knew 911 existed, but nobody had told her that waiting for a late sitter counted as an emergency. As far as she understood, the problem was not danger. The problem was that an adult was late, and good kids waited. Then Ava asked the question I had been avoiding. Was I supposed to do something else? I put my hand over hers. You were supposed to have an adult there. That was the grown-up's job. She looked down at our hands. I didn't want Grandma to be mad if I left. There it was again. Not fear of a stranger, not fear of the dark, fear of being difficult. I heard my own voice from 100 ordinary mornings. You're my easy girl. You make things so simple. I never have to worry about you. I had meant those words as praise. Sitting across from her, I heard another possible lesson inside them. The best version of you is the version that needs nothing. I could not fix that before lunch. But I could stop pretending it was harmless. Carol came over around 10 with a manila envelope the deputy had left for me, and her phone in her hand. She had slept badly too. She told me again that she had left her house before 2 on Ava's birthday and had not returned until close to midnight. She had gone to an appointment, then dinner with a friend, and her phone had spent most of the afternoon on silent in the bottom of her purse. She had not seen Ava sitting there. She had not seen my parents leave. She could only say what she saw when she came home. My porch light on, Ava on the bench, a gift bag beside her, and no adult answering my door. Then Carol said, "There's something else I didn't notice until after the deputy left." She opened her messages. At 2:06 p.m., my mother had texted her. Lauren's sitter seems late. If you see Ava out front, call Lauren for me. I read it 3 times. The first time, all I saw was my mother's name and the timestamp. The second time, I noticed the phrase, Lauren's sitter. The third time, I noticed what was missing. Mom had not asked Carol to stay with Ava. She had not said, we had to leave unexpectedly. She had not named a person. She had not asked whether Carol was home. She had simply told a third person that my sitter was late and asked her to call me if she saw my daughter. Carol watched my face and started to apologize for missing the message. I stopped her. You weren't responsible for her. The words came out harder than I intended, because I was saying them to more than Carol. The deputy's note did not solve anything. It documented the facts available at the time. Carol found Ava without an adult caregiver near midnight. Ava said her grandparents had left earlier. I was overseas and I was returning home. The child welfare follow-up was similarly careful. Nobody declared who was lying. Nobody arrested anyone. Nobody handed me a neat official conclusion. That almost relieved me. I did not want a system to invent certainty for me. I wanted to know what my parents had actually done. They called shortly after noon. My mother sounded tired. My father sounded controlled. In the background, I could hear ship noise and the hollow acoustics of a cabin. They had apparently spent the morning discussing the story they wanted to tell me, because it came out cleaner than it had in Frankfurt. Mom said I had verbally changed the arrangement after her earlier message confirming they would keep Ava. According to her, I had said a sitter of mine would arrive at 2. They believed their responsibility ended then. Dad repeated that they had no reason to think Ava would be alone for more than a few minutes. For one dangerous moment, the explanation almost fit into a shape I could live with. Families miscommunicated. Schedules changed. People remembered conversations differently. I traveled for work. My parents had watched Ava many times. There had been handoffs before. Maybe I had said something that sounded different to them. Maybe they had confused this trip with another one. Maybe my horror wanted intent where carelessness was enough. Then I asked the simplest question. What was the sitter's name? Neither of them answered. Mom said I was focusing on the wrong detail. Dad said names got lost when plans changed. Mom reminded me that I was the one traveling and that she could not be expected to manage every professional arrangement I made from another country. That sentence landed exactly where guilt already lived. I had spent 3 years after Ethan's death building systems so Ava's life would not collapse every time mine became complicated. Shared calendars, backup pickups, written medication instructions, confirmed flight times, emergency contacts. My parents were woven through all of it. I had relied on them because they asked me to. Now they were describing that reliance as evidence that I had been careless. I did not argue. I told them Ava was safe and ended the call. Then I went looking for the plan they said I had changed. I searched my texts with Mom first. Dates, pickup times, screenshots of flight itineraries, photos of Ava's school schedule, grocery lists, reminders about her pediatrician. 10 days before the trip, there it was again. I might decline Frankfurt. I hate missing her birthday. Mom's reply, leave her with us. We've got her. Below that came the heart pancake plans, my flight information, and a reminder about a library book Ava had left in my parents' car. There was no sitter, no cancellation, no message saying someone else would take over. I searched 2 p.m., sitter, babysitter, backup, every name of every person who had ever watched Ava. Nothing. I checked my email, my work calendar, the booking app I used for a sitter on rare evenings when family could not help. No August 10 appointment, no payment, no confirmation. No new adult had been arranged because I had never believed one was needed. That did not prove no verbal conversation had happened. My parents could still say I had called them. They could say I had mentioned a sitter and forgotten. But the practical trail of my life made their version stranger. I documented everything. I was the woman who sent my father a text saying, I'm leaving the spare key under the ceramic frog, even though the key had been under the ceramic frog for 4 years. A same-day childcare handoff before an international trip would not normally exist only in somebody's memory. I sat at the kitchen table with my phone, a legal pad, and cold coffee, and realized I was building a timeline because I no longer trusted the people who had once been my timeline. The question of Amanda kept pushing its way back in. The cruise photo made her look guilty. She had been standing there smiling while Ava sat on my porch. She knew Mom and Dad had agreed to keep Ava for the birthday. Or, I assumed she did. For most of my life, Amanda had been the person my parents rearranged things for. If she needed childcare, Mom volunteered. If she was short on money, Dad found a way to help without calling it help. If both of us needed something at the same time, I was usually told, you'll figure it out. I had. That history made it easy to picture my sister, knowing exactly what was happening and choosing the cruise anyway. Easy stories are dangerous when you are angry. So I asked her directly, who did Mom tell you was staying with Ava? Amanda did not answer for 11 minutes. I watched the little status line under her name, like it could tell me whether she was inventing something. Finally, her message appeared. She told me you arranged someone else. I typed back. Did she tell you who? No. Did you ask? Another pause. No. She said it was handled. I felt anger rise again, but it was different now. Amanda had not asked because the answer allowed the trip to continue. That mattered, but it was not the same as knowing Ava would be left alone. I called her. She did not pick up. A minute later, she texted that the kids were with her and she could not talk freely. I almost wrote something cruel. Instead, I asked one more question. Did Mom tell you I changed the plan after they agreed to keep her? Yes, Amanda replied. She said you had somebody taking over at 2. The wording was almost identical. That should have made my parents' story stronger. Instead, it bothered me. If I had told my parents about a new sitter, why had my mother been the one telling Amanda? Why had she also been the one telling Ava? Why had she texted Carol at 2:06 that Lauren's sitter seemed late? Everywhere I looked, my supposed plan existed only through my mother's voice. Nobody had heard it from me. I went back through the call with my parents. Mom had said I changed the plan. Dad had said I left the country believing there was coverage. Neither had said, we left because of the cruise. Neither had said, we should have confirmed the sitter arrived. The sentence they kept returning to was not about their departure. It was about mine. You left the country. The phrase began to feel less like description and more like framing. I hated that thought because it pulled me toward a conclusion I was not ready to make. My parents could be selfish. My mother could rewrite arguments until she came out looking reasonable. My father could smooth over almost anything, if admitting fault threatened family peace. I knew those weaknesses. I did not know them as people who would deliberately create danger for a child. So I made myself stay with what I could prove. They had agreed to care for Ava. They had left. No sitter existed in any record I controlled. Mom had told 3 different people, Ava, Amanda, and Carol, that a sitter of mine was supposed to appear. And almost every time my parents described the incident, they began with the fact that I was overseas. That evening, Ava fell asleep on the couch with her feet under my thigh while I answered a call from work. My manager was kind, which somehow made me feel worse. He told me the Frankfurt team had covered the supplier review and that we would deal with my travel changes later. No one asked me to resign. No one implied I had failed professionally by leaving. I had spent the entire flight afraid that coming home would destroy something at work. Yet the first people to turn my business trip into a moral indictment were my own parents. After the call, I carried Ava to bed. She stirred when I tucked the blanket around her. Mom? I'm here. She asked if Grandma and Grandpa were mad. I sat beside her and said, You don't need to worry about whether grown-ups are mad right now. She accepted that more easily than I did. Downstairs, my phone lit up on the kitchen table. Amanda. I expected another defense of the cruise. Maybe an apology. Maybe a request that I stop asking questions until everyone got home. Instead, she sent one sentence. Lauren, Mom has been talking about how often you travel for months. Amanda called me the next morning before I had finished my first cup of coffee. I had been awake since 5, not because Ava needed me, but because my body no longer trusted sleep. Every time the house settled or the air conditioner clicked on, I opened my eyes and listened for footsteps. Ava was still asleep upstairs, curled around the stuffed rabbit she had owned since preschool. I stepped onto the back patio with my phone, so I would not wake her. Amanda did not say hello. She said, I need you to let me explain before you decide I knew what they were doing. The sentence told me more than an apology would have. I let her talk. She said Mom and Dad had been complaining for months that I was traveling too much. Not directly to me. At least, not in a way I had understood as serious. To Amanda, they described my schedule as if Ava spent half her life being transferred between houses. Mom would mention that Ava had stayed with them 2 nights while I was in Chicago. Then another weekend, when I had a conference in Boston. Then a delayed flight that turned one pickup into an overnight. Each event was real. The picture they created from those events was not. Amanda admitted she had heard phrases like, "We practically raise her," and "Lauren barely notices how much we do." She had not challenged them, partly because our parents had been helping her with Mason and Peyton too, partly because she had spent most of our lives accepting Mom's version of me without feeling any need to verify it. "I thought they were worried," she said. "I didn't think they were building a case against you." The phrase "building a case" made my stomach tighten, but I stopped myself from running ahead. "Did you know they had agreed to keep Ava for her birthday?" Amanda was quiet long enough that I knew the answer mattered. She said she knew they were supposed to be with Ava that morning. She also knew Mom and Dad had planned to join the cruise. According to Amanda, Mom told her a few days before departure that I had arranged someone else to take over after lunch. Amanda said she asked one question whether Ava was coming too, and Mom told her no, because I had other plans for Ava's birthday. Amanda had accepted that answer. "Why didn't you call me?" "I should have." "That's not what I asked." She exhaled. "Because I wanted to go." There it was, not innocence, not conspiracy. Something much more ordinary, and, in its own way, uglier. Amanda had wanted the cruise. Mom had told her everything was handled. Asking me directly might have complicated the answer. So she did what people often do when a convenient story comes from someone they trust. She left it alone. Amanda admitted she had noticed. Mom seemed rushed that morning at the port and had made some comment about Lauren's sitter being late. But Amanda had been getting 2 children through check-in, keeping track of luggage, and trying to keep Peyton from melting down. She had let Mom's problem remain. Mom's problem because the ship was boarding and the vacation was finally happening. I could blame her for that. I did blame her for that. But blame became less simple once she said it out loud. Amanda had not known Ava was sitting alone. She had not agreed to leave a 7-year-old without an adult. She had been selfish enough not to ask questions that might have threatened something she wanted. That made her morally responsible for her own silence. It did not make her the person who had created the lie. The distinction mattered because for most of our adult lives, I had barely bothered to make distinctions where Amanda was concerned. My sister had been the one who needed help. I had been the one who figured things out. When her daycare closed unexpectedly, Mom rearranged her week. When my flight was canceled, Dad said I was good at problem solving. When Amanda needed to borrow money after her divorce, our parents called it helping her get back on her feet. When I needed someone to cover one school pickup, Mom joked that I had finally remembered I had a family. I had turned all of that into a simple story. Amanda was the favorite because she asked, and I was ignored because I didn't. It was easier than examining how often my parents had narrated one sister to the other. After the call, I opened the family group chat and searched my own name. It was a strange thing to do, like looking yourself up in a history book written by relatives. I found birthday messages, school photos, reminders about dinners, my mother asking whether I had landed safely. Then I started finding the other kind. 6 months earlier, an aunt had asked whether I was gone again when I had been in Atlanta for one night. Mom had answered before I saw it. "Lauren travels constantly now, but we make sure Ava has stability." 3 months before that, Dad had joked that he deserved frequent caregiver miles because he had picked Ava up twice in 1 week while I was dealing with a supply chain crisis. Another relative had responded with a laughing emoji. I had laughed too when I saw it then. Now the joke looked different. I searched my mother's private messages next. There were dozens of practical exchanges, nothing dramatic. Ava forgot her sweater. "I'm running 10 minutes late. Can you put her library book in the side pocket?" She ate already. The routine nature of those messages had been one of the reasons I trusted them. But threaded through the ordinary logistics were comments I had absorbed without examining. "You're lucky she's such an easy child. She barely notices when you're gone. She's used to our house by now. Once, after a 3-day trip to Minneapolis, Mom had written, "She didn't even ask when you were coming home until the second night." I had read that as reassurance. Sitting at the kitchen table now, I heard something else underneath it. "Your absence is becoming normal." Nothing I found proved intent. That was important. I refused to turn ordinary family resentment into evidence just because I was angry. Parents complain. Grandparents exaggerate how much they help. Relatives make careless jokes. If I had been reading someone else's messages, I might have called all of it annoying but harmless. The problem was the pattern. My work travel had been described as a burden long before August 10. And on August 10, when my parents left Ava, the first fact they reached for was not that they had abandoned their post. It was that I had left the country. I went back to Carol's 2:06 message. "Lauren Sitter seems late. If you see Ava out front, call Lauren for me." For the first time, I noticed how efficiently it assigned every role in one sentence. The sitter was mine. The lateness was mine. Ava would be visible outside. Carol's job was to call me. My mother had written herself almost completely out of the situation, while still standing at the center of it. That afternoon, Amanda called again, this time from a quiet spot on the ship while the kids were at one of the onboard activities. Her voice was lower. "There's something else I didn't tell you." I waited. Mom asked me a weird question a couple months ago. I felt my hand close around the edge of the counter. Amanda said Mom had called after a rough week when Peyton was sick and Amanda had missed work. Mom had been talking about family, emergencies, how hard life could change after one bad phone call. Then she asked, "If something happened and Ava needed somewhere stable, could you take her?" Amanda had assumed Mom meant if I died. The simplicity of that explanation was exactly why it had worked. Ethan was already dead. I had a child. Families with one surviving parent did talk about contingency plans. After my husband died, I had updated insurance, reviewed beneficiary forms, signed school emergency contacts, and answered questions I hated answering because responsible parents answer them anyway. If something happened to you, who takes Ava? At the time, the question had felt like paperwork with grief attached. Amanda had said yes. Did she say what she meant by something happening? No, I thought she meant an accident. A health emergency. Something like that. Did Dad know? I don't know. She said we've talked about it, but Mom says we, when she means herself half the time. That sounded so much like our mother, that despite everything, I almost laughed. The sound did not come. Did she ask anything else? Amanda hesitated. She asked whether the kids would be okay sharing space if it ever came to that. She said Ava should stay with family. The sentence sat between us. 2 months before my daughter's birthday, my mother had asked my sister whether she would take Ava. Maybe it was still innocent. Maybe it was exactly the kind of contingency conversation a grandmother might start after losing a son-in-law. I reminded myself of that because I needed the discipline of not knowing yet. Suspicion can make a person feel brilliant while they are actually just frightened. I wanted facts that would survive my anger. After we hung up, I went upstairs and pulled the accordion file, where I kept the estate paperwork I had not looked at since the year Ethan died. I hated that box. It smelled faintly like dust, and the cedar blocks I kept in the closet. Inside were the documents from the months after the funeral, copies of our wills, insurance records, school authorizations, the letters I had signed while moving through a grief so thick I sometimes could not remember driving home afterward. My parents' names appeared more often than I expected. They were emergency contacts at school. That part I knew. They were listed as people authorized to pick Ava up. I knew that too. In the estate documents, they were among the people I had identified as preferred standby guardians if I died or became incapacitated. The designation was not magic. It did not mean they could simply take my daughter while I was alive. But it was a statement of trust I had put into writing during the worst year of my life. If I could not be there, These are people I believed should be considered. Amanda's name appeared farther down in the same planning notes. I sat on the floor of my closet with the folder open across my knees and felt something inside the story shift. Until then, the threat had been emotional. My parents could hurt me, lie about me, make relatives think I traveled too much. That was family damage. Paper changed the feeling. I had left structural doors open because I believed we were all on the same side. I did not change anything that afternoon, not yet. The outline of what I might need to do was forming, but I had learned one lesson from the last 2 days. Do not confuse panic with strategy. My parents were still on the ship. Ava was safe with me. I had time to understand before I acted. Ava came into the closet while I was putting the papers away. She was wearing one of Ethan's old t-shirts that I had cut down for sleeping after she insisted it smelled like Dad. She looked at the folders and asked if I was doing work. Family paperwork. That sounds boring. It is. She nodded, satisfied, then asked whether Grandma had texted me. The question was casual enough that I almost answered casually. I caught myself. She has. Is she still mad? There it was again. Ava had been the child left alone, and somehow she was still monitoring the adults for signs that she had caused trouble. I closed the file drawer. You don't have to keep track of Grandma's feelings for me. Ava thought about that. Okay. She did not look convinced. Healing, I was beginning to understand, would not happen because I said the right sentence once. That evening, my mother texted me directly. I saw the preview while I was loading the dishwasher. Amanda is confused. Please stop putting ideas in her head. The speed of it made me stop. Amanda and I had spoken without my parents. Now Mom was already trying to define what that conversation meant. A second message followed. You are exhausted and upset. We can talk when we get home. Do not turn this family against us over a misunderstanding. I read it twice. Not because the words were complicated, but because they were so familiar. My mother had a way of taking conflict and moving it one step sideways. If I was angry, the problem became my tone. If Amanda disagreed, the problem became her confusion. If the facts looked bad, the problem became everyone discussing them before Mom had a chance to explain. Dad called a few minutes later. I let it ring once before answering. He told me I needed sleep. He said no one was trying to take Ava from me. I had not accused him of that. The denial arrived before the accusation. I didn't say you were. You're digging through old conversations and upsetting your sister. Who told you that? A pause. That pause told me Amanda had been talking to them too, or Mom had been pressing her for information. I did not ask which. Dad went on in his reasonable voice, the one he used when he wanted everyone to believe emotions were happening somewhere else. He said families discussed contingency plans all the time. He said Mom asking Amanda whether she could care for Ava in an emergency was not sinister. On that point, he was right. Then he made the mistake of adding that I should be grateful they had always thought ahead because I had a job that keeps taking you away. There it was again. Not your job requires occasional travel. Not we agreed to help. A job that keeps taking you away. I asked him how many times in the last year I had traveled overnight. He did not know. I did. 8 trips. Most were 1 or 2 nights. Only 2 had been international. Ava had never missed school because of them. She had never been left without confirmed care. But numbers did not matter if the story had already been chosen. Dad told me to stop interrogating everyone and wait until they returned. I'm not interrogating anyone, I said. I'm asking people what you told them. He got quiet. That was the first moment I understood that direct communication itself was threatening something. After we hung up, I wrote down every person whose opinion I had recently heard through my parents. My aunt thought I traveled too much. According to Mom, Amanda thought Ava needed more stability. According to Dad, a cousin had supposedly said I was lucky my parents practically co-parented. According to Mom, I had almost never called any of those people and asked what they had actually said because doing that would have felt dramatic. I had been trained to avoid drama the same way Ava had been trained to avoid trouble. The next morning, Amanda sent me screenshots from an older text thread. I opened them while Ava sat at the kitchen counter drawing a purple dog with 6 legs. The first messages were ordinary. Mom checking whether Amanda could bring the kids to dinner, complaining about traffic, asking whether Mason still hated tomatoes. Then, months before the cruise, Mom wrote, "Lauren's gone again next week. I don't know how long she thinks this can keep working." Amanda had replied, "She travels for her job. Ava seems fine." Mom, fine isn't the same as stable. Amanda, what are you saying? There was a gap of almost an hour before Mom's next message. If Lauren keeps choosing work, eventually somebody will have to think about what's best for Ava. I felt the room go very quiet around me even though Ava was humming to herself 3 feet away. The sentence did not prove my parents had planned August 10. It did not prove they intended to remove Ava from my home. It did something more unsettling. It proved the story about my fitness as a mother had existed before the birthday, before Carol found Ava, before there was any incident to explain away. I scrolled back through the screenshots. My mother had not said if Lauren ever becomes unable to care for Ava. She had not said if Lauren gets sick. She had tied the concern directly to work, to my travel, to a choice I was making now. The accusation was not born after they got caught. It had been waiting for an event that could make it sound true. I looked toward Ava. She was carefully coloring the 7th leg she had decided the dog needed after all. She caught me watching and grinned. "He has extra balance." I smiled because she needed me to. Then I went upstairs, closed my bedroom door, and opened the contact information for Monica Feldman, the independent professional who had administered the structures Ethan and I put in place for Ava after his death. Until that moment, I had thought I was investigating a lie about one terrible day. Before I called Monica, I looked once more at the note beside Amanda's name in the old planning file. It had been written in my own handwriting after Ethan's funeral. "Family continuity matters." I remembered why I had written it. Ava had already lost one parent. I had wanted any future disruption to feel familiar, surrounded by people she knew. At the time, putting relatives first had seemed like the safest possible instinct. Now I understood how much authority I had given that word family, without asking what happened if the people inside it stopped acting safely. The realization did not make me feel clever. It made me feel late. Now I needed to know what future my parents had been preparing for before that day ever happened. I called Monica Feldman at 9:12 that morning. I knew the exact time, because I stared at her name on my phone for nearly a minute before I pressed it. For 3 years, Monica had belonged to the part of my life I treated like emergency equipment. Essential, carefully maintained, and best left untouched unless something went wrong. Ethan had chosen her as the independent trustee for Ava because she had no family loyalties to manage and no reason to confuse helping us with owning us. After he died, Monica had walked me through the trust in a conference room while I sat there holding a pen I barely used. I remembered almost none of the language from that day. I remembered her sliding a box of tissues toward me without comment. I remembered her saying that her job was to protect Ava's money from everybody, including people who loved her. This time, I asked for a meeting. Monica could see me that afternoon. I arranged for Carol to stay with Ava for 2 hours, not because Ava could not be alone with a sitter I trusted, but because I wanted her to know exactly where I was going and exactly when I would return. That was new. Before I left, I wrote Carol's number on an index card and taped it beside the refrigerator. Even though Ava was staying with Carol next door, Ava watched me do it and asked why. "So you always know who to call," I said. She nodded and went back to coloring. The simplicity of her acceptance made me feel both better and worse. Monica's office was in a low building near Winter Park, cool enough inside that my arms prickled after the parking lot heat. She greeted me the same way. She always had no hug, no dramatic sympathy, just a firm handshake and a careful look at my face. I appreciated that. I had spent 4 days being told I was too emotional by people who had created the emergency. I did not need another person deciding what my feelings meant before I spoke. I told her the short version first. My parents had agreed to care for Ava. They left for a cruise. They claimed I had arranged a sitter for 2. No sitter existed. My mother told Ava where to wait. My mother also texted a neighbor at 2:06 saying, "Lauren's sitter seems late." Before the birthday, my parents had been telling Amanda and other relatives that I traveled too much and that Ava needed stability. 2 months earlier, Mom had asked Amanda whether she could take Ava if something happened. Monica listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked one question. "What exactly are you afraid they are trying to do?" I hated how hard it was to answer. Saying the fear aloud made it sound bigger, and therefore more embarrassing if I was wrong. "I don't know. That's the problem. I'm afraid they've been preparing some version of me as an unfit mother." She did not tell me I was overreacting. She also did not tell me I was right. Instead, she pulled Ava's trust summary onto her screen and started with limits. The trust was Ava's. Not mine. Not my parents. Not Amanda's. Ethan had funded it with life insurance and investments, and Monica controlled distributions under the support standard he had chosen. If Ava needed tuition, therapy, medical care, tutoring, a portion of housing directly attributable to her needs, or reasonable childcare, Monica could pay or reimburse those expenses, depending on the request and documentation. A guardian could not simply empty the account. A relative could not move Ava into a house and start paying personal credit cards from her money. Nobody acquired ownership of the trust by becoming a caregiver. That answer should have calmed me. Instead, I heard the word caregiver differently. If Ava lived with someone else, I said, could the trust pay costs in that household? For Ava's benefit, yes. Potentially. Not the household's general lifestyle. Not someone else's debt. But a child creates real costs. Housing, transportation, school needs, childcare. The trust follows the beneficiary's needs. So, if Amanda were caring for her, then Amanda could request reimbursement or direct payment for qualifying expenses related to Ava. I would still review them. I would still have discretion. And nothing about being a relative would automatically entitle her to $1. Monica said it so plainly that the idea lost some of its sinister shape. Nobody could steal $1.8 million by getting Ava into a spare bedroom. That mattered. I did not want to build my own false story, just because my parents had built one about me. Then I asked the question that had brought me there. "Have my parents ever asked you about that?" Monica did not answer immediately. She explained what she could discuss with me as Ava's parent and legal representative, and what she would not. She would not hand me gossip, speculate about people's intentions, or treat general administrative questions like proof of wrongdoing. But she could confirm inquiries about the administration of Ava's trust, where those inquiries related to the beneficiary and my role protecting her interests. Then she said yes. My mother and father had both asked general questions over the previous few months about what would happen if Ava's lawful caregiver changed, whether the trust could pay for expenses at a different residence, and whether childcare and school costs could continue if Ava lived with a relative. I stared at her. "Both of them?" Monica held up one hand. "Lauren, I'm not telling you why they asked. I'm telling you what they asked." "When?" She checked her notes. The first contact had been in late June. A follow-up came in July. Late June. That was before I had booked Frankfurt. Before August 10. Before my daughter sat on the bench. I felt a strange pressure behind my ribs. Not panic exactly. More like the sensation of reaching a stair in the dark and finding nothing under your foot. Monica turned the screen slightly so I could see the record she was allowed to show me. It was not dramatic. No secret letter. No plan titled Take Ava. Just a short administrative note. Family members asked about potential change in caregiver, residence. Clarified that trust remains under independent administration. Qualifying distributions continue for beneficiary. No general family support. It was the kind of note I might once have skimmed and forgotten. Now it sat beside Amanda's screenshot in my mind. If Lauren keeps choosing work, eventually somebody will have to think about what's best for Ava. I asked Monica whether she had ever discussed a specific person. Not in any way I'm comfortable characterizing beyond the notes, she said. There were hypothetical questions about a relative caregiver. That's all I can responsibly tell you right now. I wanted more. But I respected the boundary, because the boundary was exactly why Ethan had trusted her. On the drive home, I did not call my parents. I called Amanda. She answered on the second ring. The cruise had reached one of its Bahamas stops, and I could hear wind against her microphone. I asked whether she could send me every message from Mom or Dad about the trip, Ava, my work schedule, or the idea of Ava ever living with her. Not selected screenshots. Everything relevant. Amanda was quiet. You think this was planned? I think I need to know whether it was. That distinction mattered to me. I could feel myself wanting certainty before I had earned it. Amanda sent the messages over the next hour in pieces. I sat at my dining table with my laptop open and lined up what we knew by date. 10 days before Ava's birthday, I told Mom I might refuse Frankfurt because the timing felt wrong. She told me to go. Leave her with us. We've got her. At that point, according to Amanda's booking confirmation, the Carnival trip had already been purchased. Mom and Dad had known they were sailing on August 10 when they reaffirmed that they would care for Ava. 4 days before departure, Mom told Amanda I had arranged someone else for the afternoon. I had not. The morning of the birthday, Mom told Ava the same thing. At 2:06, she told Carol my sitter was late and asked Carol to call me if she saw Ava outside. And there was one detail I had overlooked because it had seemed almost too small to matter. Mom did not ask Carol to go check on Ava. She asked Carol to call me if she saw her. That wording changed shape once I put it beside everything else. If Mom's only concern had been a late sitter, the obvious request was, "Can you please go stay with Ava until we sort this out?" Instead, she gave Carol a story and a task. Lauren's sitter is late. If you see Ava, call Lauren. The person who needed to be notified was me. The person who needed to be associated with the failed sitter was me. The child needed to be visible. I called Carol and asked her to read the message exactly as it appeared, punctuation and all. She did. I asked whether Mom had followed up later that afternoon. Nah. Had Dad texted? Nah. Had either of them tried calling her? No. Carol sounded sick when she understood what I was asking. I thought she was just trying to help. So did I. There was no victory in saying it. I went back through my own phone records. No outgoing call to my parents after the "We've got her" message, changing plans. No sitter booking, no payment, no email, no calendar event, nothing. My parents' version depended entirely on an alleged verbal conversation that only they claimed had happened. And yet somehow that invisible conversation had been communicated in advance to 3 different people. Amanda, Ava, and Carol, all through my mother. I still resisted the conclusion. People lie after making terrible decisions. That did not prove they engineered the terrible decision. My parents could have decided late that they wanted the cruise, invented the sitter excuse to Amanda, left Ava recklessly, and then used the same lie afterward to save themselves. That would have been monstrous enough. I needed to know what separated a cover-up from a setup. The answer was Ava, not because she understood any of it, Because of what she had been told to do before anyone could know, a cover-up would be necessary. At 2, go outside. Sit where the sitter can see you. Do not leave, because she is coming. My mother had not merely invented a sitter after Carol found Ava. She had given Ava instructions built around that non-existent person before she left for Port Canaveral. And then, 6 minutes after the time she told Ava to wait outside, she messaged the neighbor across the street and planted the explanation for why the child would be there. I stopped writing. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the refrigerator, humming, and Ava laughing next door at something Carol had said. The shape of the day finally became coherent. My parents did not need Ava alone all afternoon. In fact, the longer she remained alone, the more dangerous the situation became for them. What made sense was something shorter, a gap, a visible failure. Ava, outside, Carol notices. Carol calls me in Germany. There is now a third person who can say, Lauren's supposed sitter did not arrive. My parents get to be on the cruise, physically removed from the moment of discovery, while the story begins with my name attached to the failed handoff. They had expected Carol to be home. They had not checked. They had not confirmed she had seen the message. They had not confirmed another adult had actually taken custody of Ava before the ship left. Their plan had depended on somebody else cleaning up the danger quickly. Nobody did. The staged gap became almost 10 real hours. I pressed both hands flat against the dining table. That was the moment my anger changed. Until then, I had been angry at what they chose over Ava, the cruise. Amanda, convenience, favoritism. Now I was angry at what they had chosen to use Ava for. A record, an example, a story about me. I thought of Mom calling me her easy daughter. I thought of Dad saying, I always figured things out. They had counted on the same trait twice. They counted on Ava being quiet enough to wait, and they counted on me being competent enough to clean up whatever happened afterward without collapsing publicly. The cruelty of it was not that they believed we were weak. It was that they believed we were predictable. I called Amanda again. This time, when she answered, I asked her to think carefully before responding. Did Mom ever say what was supposed to happen if people decided I wasn't stable enough? Amanda said no at first. Then she corrected herself. Mom had talked about family stepping in. She had used phrases like temporary help and keeping Ava with people she knew. Amanda had assumed it was the same contingency conversation as before. Did she ever say you? A pause. Not exactly. Amanda. She said if things ever got bad, it would make more sense for Ava to be with me than with strangers. I closed my eyes. There it was. Still not a legal plan. Still not a petition. Still not proof that any judge or agency would agree. But the endpoint was no longer abstract. My parents had been building a story in which I was absent, had asked Amanda whether she could take Ava, had asked Monica what happened if Ava lived with a relative, and then had created a fake childcare handoff on a day when I was physically outside the country. You never told me any of this. I didn't think it was this. What did you think it was? My parents worrying, Mom being Mom. You know how she is. I did know. That was part of the problem. We had spent our whole lives translating her behavior into something smaller so we could keep living around it. Amanda's voice cracked when she said she had never wanted Ava taken from me. I believed that more than I had 2 days earlier. I also believed she had allowed herself not to look too closely, because being the daughter our parents helped was easier than asking what their help cost somebody else. Both things could be true. Before we ended the call, I asked Amanda to stop discussing our conversations with Mom and Dad unless she wanted to. Not because I needed secrecy, but because I wanted the next exchange to be direct. Amanda surprised me by agreeing. My parents sensed the change before I contacted them. Amanda was still in contact with them on the cruise, and I did not know whether she had mentioned Monica. I only knew Dad called before I ever brought Monica up to him. Dad called first. He did not ask about Ava. He asked why I had contacted Monica. For a second, I forgot to answer because the question itself told me they were paying attention to doors they did not officially control. Why do you care? Because estate matters are family business, Lauren. No, Ava's trust is Ava's business. He sighed. This is exactly what I was afraid of. You're turning one mistake into a war. One mistake. I looked at the timeline on the table. June inquiries. July follow-up. Cruise booking. We've got her. Amanda's messages. Ava's instructions. Carol's 2:06 text. I'm not the one who made it more than one day, I said. Dad's tone changed. Less soothing, more impatient. He said Monica was a professional who did not understand our family, that dragging fiduciaries and legal structures into an emotional disagreement would make everything harder to repair. He wanted me to wait until they were home. Again, the same request. Stop comparing information until the people who controlled the information could return and explain it. Mom called 10 minutes later. She did ask about Ava, but only after telling me Amanda was overwhelmed and that Carol was making things worse by reading intent into one text message. That was not true. Carol had done almost nothing except answer my questions. Then Mom gave me what she called an apology. We never imagined you would leave without a backup. I actually pulled the phone away from my ear and looked at it. Not, we never imagined Ava would be alone. Not, we should have made sure someone was there. You would leave without a backup. The sentence was so perfectly aligned with everything else that I stopped needing her to confess. You told Ava a sitter was coming. Because I believed one was. You told Amanda I arranged her. That's what I understood. You told Carol my sitter was late. I was trying to help. You told me you had Ava. Until the plan changed. Every answer returned to the same invisible conversation. I did not argue longer. I said, when you get home, we can talk about what happened. But I'm not accepting a version that depends on a person nobody can name and a conversation nobody can document. Mom's voice sharpened. Be very careful, Lauren. You are upset, and you are starting to see plots where there were mistakes. Maybe she believed that. Maybe she needed to. I ended the call before the conversation became a courtroom. Neither of us had authority to run. That evening, Monica called me back. I was sitting on the floor beside Ava's bed while she sorted plastic beads into color piles. Monica said she had reviewed her notes more carefully because of my question about prior inquiries. She repeated the same caution. A question was not evidence of intent. People asked hypothetical questions about trusts all the time, but one inquiry had been specific enough that she wanted me to understand it accurately. Someone had asked whether reasonable housing and caregiving expenses could be paid from Ava's trust if Ava were living with a lawful guardian in another household. I stood and walked into the hallway. Another household? Yes. Did you tell them the guardian would control the trust? No. I explained the opposite. The trust remains independently administered. Qualifying expenses may be paid for Ava's benefit. That does not give a caregiver ownership of the funds. My heart was beating harder now, but the feeling was no longer panic. It was recognition. They had known. Not that they could take the money. Monica had made that impossible to misunderstand. They had known that money for Ava's legitimate needs could follow Ava to wherever she lawfully lived. I looked through the open bedroom door. Ava was still arranging beads, lips pursed in concentration, unaware that adults had been asking questions about which household might one day submit expenses on her behalf. I refused to make the leap Monica had warned me against. A financial question did not prove a financial motive. It did not prove fraud. It did not prove my parents wanted $1 for themselves. The central fact remained what they had done to Ava and the story they were constructing about me. But the question meant they had been thinking beyond temporary babysitting, beyond concern, beyond a grandmother worrying that her daughter worked too much. They had been thinking about a different household, a different caregiver, a different structure around my child. I asked Monica the question that had been sitting underneath everything since I walked into her office. Who asked that? There was a brief pause while she checked the note. Then she said, "Both of your parents, Lauren, Diane and William, were on the call. For most of my life, I had treated my father's calmness as evidence that he was the safer parent. Mom decided things. Dad softened them. Mom told you what was best for you." Dad found a way to make the sentence sound less sharp. "When I was 16 and wanted to spend a summer working instead of joining a family trip, Mom called me ungrateful. Dad waited until later and told me she was only afraid I was growing up too fast. When Amanda and I fought in college, Mom chose sides before either of us finished speaking. Dad told us not to make it bigger than it was. He had spent decades looking like the reasonable man standing beside the difficult woman." Monica's sentence stripped that protection away. "Both of your parents, Lauren, Diane and William, were on the call. I asked her what Dad had actually said. She would not dramatize it for me. She went back to the notes and described the questions in the same careful tone she used for everything else. My father had asked how qualifying housing costs were determined if Ava lived with someone other than me. He had asked whether school-related transportation could be paid if a guardian lived farther from Ava's current school. He had asked how childcare expenses were treated when the caregiver also had children of their own. Mom had asked more general questions about whether support followed Ava. Dad had asked how the numbers worked. That distinction hurt in a way I was not prepared for. My father had spent his career in accounting and finance. He understood the difference between a beneficiary and a caregiver. He understood that a household could benefit indirectly without anyone stealing anything. A child living in a home adds grocery costs, transportation, utilities, space, school needs, after-school care. If a trust legitimately paid Ava's share of those expenses, the caregiver's household would not become rich. But raising Ava would not cost that household what raising another child ordinarily cost. I thought about Amanda before I let myself think about motive. My sister had not been hiding that money was tight. Her work hours had been reduced earlier that year. Medical billing was steady work when the hours existed, but she had gone from a full schedule to enough cutbacks that every unexpected cost became a negotiation. Mom and Dad were already helping with after-school pickup for Mason and Peyton. Dad had covered a car repair in spring. Mom bought school clothes because the kids were growing anyway, the same way she always turned financial help into something too casual to count. I had noticed all of that without connecting it to Ava because there had been no reason to. Now there was. I called Amanda as soon as Monica and I finished. She answered from the ship, but the call kept breaking up. I asked whether she could talk privately later. She said yes, then asked if Monica had told me something new. I almost said, Dad was in it too. Instead, I told her I needed to ask about money, and I heard the change in her breathing, even through the bad connection. We spoke an hour later when she found a quiet corner away from the kids. I kept my voice level because I did not want her to confuse calm with forgiveness. "How bad are things right now?" "What things?" "Your finances." Her first reaction was anger. She asked what that had to do with anything. I reminded her that Mom and Dad had asked a trustee what Ava's trust could pay if Ava lived with a relative. Then I told her Dad had specifically asked about housing, school transportation, and childcare. The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to hear ship machinery somewhere behind her. Amanda said her rent had gone up when she renewed. Her hours had been cut. Summer childcare for 2 kids had cost more than she expected. She was not facing eviction. She was not drowning in secret debt. She was simply living with almost no margin. 1 dental bill, 1 broken transmission, 1 week without enough hours, and the month stopped balancing. Mom and Dad knew because they had been filling small gaps for most of the year. "Did they ever connect Ava to that?" I asked. Amanda said no too quickly. I waited. "Not like that." "What does that mean?" She rubbed at something near the microphone and lowered her voice. Mom said if Ava ever had to stay with me, it wouldn't have to ruin me financially. My stomach turned cold. Her words? Not exactly. Amanda, she sighed. She said, Ava's money would cover Ava's share, so it wouldn't hurt you. I closed my eyes. The sentence was not a confession. That mattered. It did not prove Mom wanted the trust. It did not prove Amanda had agreed to some financial scheme. It was exactly the kind of thing a practical grandmother might say in a genuine contingency conversation. If tragedy happened, and you had to take in a child, the child's existing resources would help with the child's needs. But context had changed the sentence. My parents had not asked Amanda that question after an accident. They had asked it while they were telling her I traveled too much. They had not asked Monica about distributions after I became sick or unable to parent. They had asked before my Frankfurt trip, before the birthday, while building a story about stability. Then they created an incident designed to look as if my care arrangement failed while I was outside the country. The same hypothetical kept appearing before the emergency that supposedly made it relevant. That was what made it stop feeling hypothetical. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook in front of me and drew 3 columns, because my brain needed something orderly to do. In the first column, I wrote what my parents said they wanted: stability for Ava. In the second, what they had already arranged: Amanda willing to take her if needed. In the third, what they had asked Monica: whether Ava's legitimate expenses could be supported in another household. None of those facts, alone, was sinister. Together, they described a future. Ava living with Amanda. Mason and Peyton still in the house. My parents close enough to remain central. Amanda no longer carrying the full incremental cost of another child because Ava's trust could pay Ava's qualifying share. And me positioned outside that household as the mother whose work had finally gone too far. That was the major shift I had been resisting since Carol's call. My parents were not trying to steal my daughter's trust. Monica had made that impossible to misunderstand. They were trying to create a family arrangement in which the trust made their preferred outcome easier to sustain. Control first, money second. The money did not create the plan. It made the plan practical. I pressed the heel of my hand against my forehead and tried to imagine how my parents had justified it to themselves. Mom probably told herself Ava needed a more traditional home, one where the parent was not flying to Germany for work. Dad probably told himself Amanda needed help and Ava needed family, so if one arrangement solved 2 problems, why was that wrong? Maybe they never used the word take. Maybe they called it stepping in, helping, protecting, keeping the children together. Families can do terrible things inside words that sound generous. Amanda was still on the phone. You knew they were talking about her money, I said. She snapped back that she knew Ava had a trust. Everyone did. Ethan had died. It was not a secret. That's not what I said. I didn't ask them for it. I didn't say you did. You're talking like I was waiting for them to hand me your kid and a check. Her anger hit mine, and for a few seconds I wanted to let it. I wanted the clean relief of having one person I could blame without qualification. Amanda had gone on the cruise. Amanda had benefited from our parents' favoritism for years. Amanda had heard our mother talk about Ava living with her, and had not called me. She had heard that Ava's money could cover Ava's share, and had allowed that future to sit in the room without asking what would have to happen to me for it to become real. But she had not told Ava to sit on a bench. She had not invented a sitter. She had not sent Carol a message at 2:06. I forced myself to keep the line where the facts put it. I believe you didn't know what they were going to do on her birthday, I said. I also believe you liked the version where Mom and Dad kept telling you everything would work out. Amanda said nothing. You didn't need to ask hard questions because the answer kept making your life easier. That's not fair. It's not as unfair as what happened to Ava. She made a sound like she had started to answer and stopped. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter. I thought if something ever happened to you, she'd come to me. I thought that was all this was. And when Mom tied it to my job, I told myself she was being dramatic. And when she said Ava's money would cover her share, I thought she was trying to reassure me. And when she said I arranged a sitter, Amanda's voice broke. I wanted the cruise. That was the most honest thing she had said to me. We stayed quiet for a while. I could hear the faint, bright sounds of vacation around her music. Kids somewhere far enough away to be indistinct, a door opening and closing. I wondered what it felt like to be standing in the place that had become the symbol of the worst day of my life, while realizing you had stepped onto it because you had decided not to ask one more question. I'm not asking you to make me feel better, I said. I need you to remember exactly what they told you. Not what you think they meant. Not what would make this easier for either of us. Amanda agreed. Then she asked me something I had not expected. Are you going to keep me away from Ava too? I looked toward the living room. Ava was on the rug building a crooked tower with blocks. She had been quieter since I came home, but not dramatically so. That was part of what scared me. She still laughed, still asked for cereal, still complained when socks twisted inside her shoes. Trauma had not turned her into a different child overnight. It had simply added new calculations to ordinary moments. I don't know yet, I said. Amanda inhaled sharply. I'm not punishing you because Mom and Dad lied. But I'm not pretending your judgment had nothing to do with this either. She said she understood. I was not sure she did. I was not sure I did either. After we hung up, I found Ava on the floor surrounded by construction paper, glue sticks, and plastic beads. She had moved on from the tower and was now trying to attach a paper heart to a piece of cardboard without gluing her fingers together. The yellow birthday gift bag sat beside her. I stopped in the doorway. I had carried that bag home from Carol's and put it on a shelf where I could see it without having to open it. Part of me had been afraid of what was inside. Not because I expected evidence, because I expected love. Ava looked up. Can I finish this before Grandma comes back? I sat down beside her. Finish what? She pulled out a folded card decorated with purple stars and one crooked red heart. Her handwriting was uneven, some letters too large, some squeezed together. She had written, "Thank you for always taking care of me." Underneath, she had drawn herself between Grandma and Grandpa, all three holding hands. Grandpa's hair was bright blue because Ava had apparently run out of gray marker. Grandma had a yellow dress. Ava had drawn herself with 7 fingers raised on one hand again, a mistake that made me want to laugh and cry at the same time. I was going to give it after cake, she said. I touched the edge of the card, but did not pick it up. You made this before your birthday? She nodded. At school camp, Miss Tessa helped me spell taking. There are facts that change a legal argument, and there are facts that change the temperature of a room. That card did the second kind of work. My parents had spent months talking about who should take care of Ava. Ava had already decided who she believed was taking care of her, them. She had carried that belief outside and sat beside it for hours in a yellow bag. Do you think they'll like it? She asked. I swallowed. I think they'll understand what it means. That was not a lie, though it was not the answer she thought I was giving. Ava went back to gluing beads. I sat with her until the card was finished. I did not tell her what Monica had said. I did not explain household costs, trustee discretion, or the fact that adults had been discussing a future in which she might live with her aunt. She was 7. None of that belonged on her shoulders. But the card stayed with me the rest of the day. It reminded me that every practical decision I made next had to be about Ava, not about making my parents hurt the way I hurt. Revenge is easy to understand when you are furious. Protection is harder, because protection requires you to choose actions that still make sense after the anger cools. Late that afternoon, Monica sent me a short written summary of what we had discussed. Nothing accusatory, just the trust terms, the fact that she remained independent, and confirmation that prior inquiries had concerned qualifying expenses in another lawful caregiver's household. I saved it with the other records and did not send it to my parents. I no longer needed to show them every piece of information I had. Their reaction to my contacting Monica had already told me enough about how entitled they felt to remain inside decisions that were not theirs. Dad texted near dinner, "We're back Saturday morning. We need to sit down as a family." A minute later, Mom sent her own message. "We'll come straight from the ship and pick Ava up so everyone can calm down together." I read it twice. Pick Ava up. Not come see Ava. Not ask whether she wanted to see them. Pick her up. As if the last 5 days had been an argument between adults and their old access remained untouched. As if they still had the school authorization, the spare key, the emergency contact status, the assumption that if they arrived at my door and said "Grandma is taking you," Ava would put on her shoes. That was when the rest of the architecture became visible to me. My parents had not needed formal authority for most of what they wanted, because I had already given them informal authority everywhere. They knew her school. They could pick her up. They were approved emergency contacts. They were written into my contingency planning. They were trusted by relatives, neighbors, teachers, pediatric staff, and by Ava herself. The future they had imagined did not require one dramatic act of taking control. It could be built out of dozens of doors I had opened for them over years. And those doors were still open. I went upstairs to the closet and pulled the estate file out again. This time I did not sit on the floor and stare at it. I carried it to the dining table. Then I brought down Ava's school emergency forms, the pediatric authorization folder, the list of people allowed to pick her up, and the document where I had once written my parents' names under preferred standby guardians. I put my phone beside the stack and opened my contacts. First, I called Ava's school office and asked what I needed to do to update pickup permissions before classes resumed. Then I emailed the attorney who had helped Ethan and me with our estate plan. Then I messaged Monica and asked what formal communication safeguards already existed around the trust, and what needed clarification. I did not know yet exactly how many things I would change. I knew only that by the time Carnival Freedom returned to Port Canaveral, my parents were not going to walk back into the same family structure they had left. Ava's handmade card sat at the edge of the table while I worked. "Thank you for always taking care of me." I looked at those words once before opening the first form. Then I started closing the doors they thought were still theirs. The first door was the easiest, because it belonged to a school office and not to my family. I had expected the call to feel dramatic. Instead, it sounded almost offensively ordinary. The registrar asked me to confirm my identity, pulled up Ava's file, and explained how to remove authorized pickup names and update emergency contacts before classes resumed. I had filled out those forms so many times that I could picture my parents' names without looking. Diane Carter, grandmother. William Carter, grandfather. Approved to pick up. Approved for emergency release. People school staff recognized. People who had stood in that front office smiling, while Ava ran toward them with her backpack bouncing against her shoulders. I had once considered that familiarity a safety net. Now I understood that access without current trust was not safety. It was exposure. I removed both names. The registrar asked if I wanted to add replacements. I added Carol as a local emergency contact and left the second slot temporarily blank until I could confirm another adult who understood what being backup actually meant. The woman on the phone did not ask for the family story. She did not need one. I was Ava's mother. I was changing the people authorized to collect my child. That was enough. Still, when she read the updated list back to me, and my parents' names were gone, I felt a physical pull in my chest. For 3 years after Ethan died, seeing those names had made me feel less alone. Removing them felt like admitting that the help I had depended on had never been as permanent as I believed. The pediatric office came next. My parents had been listed for emergency pickup, records coordination, and limited caregiver communication because they had taken Ava to appointments when I traveled. I removed those permissions too. I did not revoke anyone's ability to call 911, obviously. I did not try to create a wall around Ava so high that family could never reach her. I removed the assumption that Grandma or Grandpa could walk into a system, identify themselves, and be treated as extensions of me. The distinction mattered. I was not erasing that they were Ava's grandparents. I was erasing authority I had given them because I once trusted how they would use it. By 10:30 Friday morning, I had changed more of Ava's practical life than I had in the previous 3 years. The next step was harder because it involved my own documents and Ethan's name on nearly every page. The estate attorney who had worked with us before Ethan died called me back between appointments. I told her enough to explain why I needed the guardian nomination reviewed immediately, but I did not turn the call into a family confession. She reminded me of something I already knew and needed to hear again. My nomination of a preferred guardian did not give anyone present custody rights while I was alive and competent. It mattered if I died or became unable to care for Ava. It was a statement of preference for a future court to consider, not a secret switch my parents could flip. That should have made the old document feel harmless. It did not. My parents had spent months imagining a future where Ava lived somewhere else. I no longer wanted my own planning documents helping that future feel natural. So we changed them. Diane and William came off the preferred list. Amanda came off too. I hesitated before I said my sister's name. That hesitation told me I was still trying to separate love from judgment. Amanda had not engineered the birthday. I believed that. She had not told Ava to sit outside. She had not invented a sitter. But when my mother floated a future where Ava might live with her, Amanda had allowed that possibility to stay comfortable because it did not threaten anything she wanted. I could forgive parts of that someday. Forgiveness was not the same as naming her as the person I wanted holding my daughter's life if I could not. The attorney did not push me to choose a dramatic replacement on the spot. We discussed a neutral, trusted structure, consistent with Ethan's estate planning, and the need for a responsible adult who had no financial or emotional stake in separating Ava from the life she already had. I identified a longtime family friend Ethan and I had trusted for years as the preferred personal guardian if a true contingency ever occurred, subject to final review and willingness. The point was not to create a new hero. The point was to stop assuming blood relation automatically meant safest option. When the call ended, I sat at the dining table staring at the signature page for several minutes. The house was quiet, except for the low hum of the ceiling fan, and the occasional thump from Ava's room where she was building something out of cardboard boxes. I thought about the Lauren who had signed the original document after Ethan died. She had been exhausted, terrified, and determined to make sure Ava would never feel completely alone if something happened to her too. She had chosen family continuity because it felt like the opposite of loss. Now I understood that continuity without trust could become its own kind of danger. Monica called just before lunch. I told her what I was changing and asked what needed to happen on her side. She reminded me again that the trust itself was irrevocable. I could not rewrite it because I was angry. I could not appoint myself sole controller. I could not issue some magical instruction saying my family never gets to make a request again under any circumstances. If, years from now, someone lawfully became Ava's guardian, that person could still communicate with the trustee about Ava's legitimate needs, because the trust existed for Ava, not for my preferences. What Monica could do, and what she documented immediately, was make the communication boundary explicit. No relative, grandparent, or prospective caregiver had any current authority to request distributions, obtain administrative information, or represent Ava's needs merely because they were family. Any future request would require actual lawful authority and would be evaluated independently under the trust terms. My parents' past administrative questions did not create standing. Amanda's hypothetical willingness to take Ava did not create standing. Nobody could turn family familiarity into a financial channel. I appreciated the boring precision of it. Boring was exactly what I wanted. I had had enough of adults using vague words like help, stability, family, and backup to hide who actually had responsibility. After we finished, Monica asked whether I had preserved the records surrounding August 10th. Not because she was preparing a case for me. She was careful not to step outside her role. She simply told me that if I believed statements might later be disputed, I should preserve what already existed, rather than relying on memory. So I did. I downloaded the thread containing, "Leave her with us. We've got her." I saved the surrounding conversation so nobody could later claim the sentence had been clipped out of context. I exported my travel itinerary, not because I was ashamed of it, but because I wanted the timeline clear. Frankfurt, departure date. Return flight after Carol's call. I saved screenshots and metadata from Diane's 2:06 p.m. message to Carol. Carol wrote a short factual account of what she personally saw near midnight and nothing more. She did not claim she watched Ava all afternoon. She did not speculate about why my mother had texted her. She simply recorded when she came home, where Ava was, what Ava told her, and what the house looked like when she checked. I put the deputy's information and the child welfare follow-up in the same digital folder. I saved Amanda's forwarded messages exactly as she had sent them, including the parts that made her look bad, especially those parts. If I was going to insist that my parents had built a false story out of selected facts, I could not start building my own version by hiding anything inconvenient. There was no secret surveillance footage, no miraculous camera angle, no stranger who had recorded the entire afternoon. The evidence was mundane, because real life usually is. Texts, timestamps, travel records, forms, a child's simple recollection, a neighbor's limited observation. The strength was not in one explosive item. It was in how poorly my parents' story fit the ordinary record of how all of us had behaved. By early afternoon, the dining table looked like the aftermath of a small office. Laptop open, chargers stretched across the floor, school forms, estate drafts, a legal pad covered in times and names. Ava's handmade card sat near the edge, safely away from my coffee. I noticed how easily protection could start to resemble obsession from the outside. I had spent days reconstructing conversations, preserving records, talking to professionals. If someone wanted to describe me as frantic, controlling, unstable, they could photograph that table and tell whatever story they liked. The thought stopped me. That was exactly the trap I could not live inside. I closed the laptop for an hour. Ava and I made grilled cheese. She asked if the cheese counted as lunch, if one corner burned black. I told her carbon was technically part of nature, which made her laugh even though she had no idea what I meant. We ate at the counter. She told me Carol had promised to show her how to grow basil from a grocery store plant. She asked when school started. She asked whether Mason and Peyton were still on the boat. Normal questions, each one reminding me that her life could not become a permanent crime scene just because adults had behaved badly. After lunch, she went outside to draw with sidewalk chalk. I stood in the doorway while she covered the front walk with stars and crooked flowers. She avoided the porch bench without seeming to notice that she was avoiding it. I noticed. I almost told her she was being brave. The phrase died before I said it. For years, I had praised Ava for being brave, when what I often meant was easy to manage. Brave at the dentist, because she did not cry. Brave when I traveled, because she did not complain. Brave after Ethan died because she learned how to sleep without asking me to sit beside her every night. I had not meant to reward silence, but children are better at learning patterns than adults are at explaining intentions. So when she came back inside and asked if I could help wash pink chalk off her palms because it was stuck around her nails, I did not tell her she could do it herself. I turned on the sink and helped. It was a tiny thing. It mattered more than I expected. My manager called around 3. I had been dreading the conversation since Frankfurt. I had left an international supplier review with almost no notice. My deputy had carried a presentation that should have been mine. A facility meeting had been rescheduled. The company had absorbed costs because my family emergency was not considerate enough to fit a calendar. I apologized for the disruption, without apologizing for going home. That distinction took effort. My manager told me the team had covered what they could, and that there would be practical consequences to sort out missed meetings, another review cycle, questions about when I could resume travel. He did not threaten my job. He did not tell me motherhood made me unreliable. He asked when I realistically expected to return to normal duties. I almost said I would stop traveling. The answer rose automatically, because guilt likes grand gestures. If I never got on another plane, nobody could ever again use an ocean between me and Ava as proof I had failed her. It would also mean my parents' framing had worked. I would be letting the people who engineered danger define what safe motherhood looked like. I'm not resigning from travel, I said, but I'm rebuilding my childcare system before I book another trip. My manager said that sounded reasonable. The sentence nearly made me cry, because reasonable was all I had wanted the people closest to me to be. We agreed I would work remotely for a short period, then return to the office schedule with travel paused until I had documented backup arrangements. There would be professional awkwardness. I would have to rebuild momentum on the project I left. Someone else might lead the next supplier review. Those were real costs, but they were not a moral verdict on me. They were consequences of leaving work during an emergency, and I could accept them without turning my career into the villain. When that call ended, I realized my guilt had shifted. It was still there, but it was no longer ordering me around. I could look at the fact that I had been in Germany without turning that fact into a confession. I had arranged care. The people responsible had broken it. My responsibility now was not to prove I would never need help again. It was to choose help more carefully. Amanda called just after 4. The ship would be back at Port Canaveral the next morning. Her voice sounded exhausted. I told her I had changed my estate plan and removed her from the preferred guardian list along with Mom and Dad. She went quiet. When she finally spoke, she said, "I figured you would." There was hurt in her voice, enough that part of me wanted to soften what I had done. Old habits are stubborn. I wanted to tell her it was temporary. I wanted to reassure her that this did not mean I thought she was a terrible mother. I wanted to make the consequence easier for the sister who had spent most of our lives being protected from hard edges. Instead, I told the truth. I'm not saying you would hurt Ava. I'm saying I can't put you in a document that assumes your judgment is the one I trust most if I'm gone. Amanda swallowed audibly. Because I went on the cruise. Because you heard Mom building a future around my daughter and never thought I needed to know. That's not the same thing as what they did. I know. The fact that I agreed seemed to disarm her more than an argument would have. I told her I was not making her carry our parents' guilt. I was making her carry her own decision. She had believed a convenient version because believing it cost her nothing. Now truth cost her something. Not Ava, not money, not revenge. Trust. Amanda said very quietly, "I understand." I did not ask her to prove it. Not yet. Before we hung up, she told me Mom had been trying to get her to promise that we would all sit down together after they docked. Amanda had refused to answer. I thanked her for telling me and left it there. Our relationship was not healed because we had started exchanging accurate information. It was simply no longer being managed through our parents. For the moment, that was enough. The last thing I did that afternoon was assemble the box. I used a plain white gift box from the closet, where I kept wrapping supplies. No dramatic ribbon, no black folder, no legal packet designed for theater. I placed Ava's handmade card on top, because that was the part they needed to see first. Thank you for always taking care of me. Purple stars, crooked heart, bright blue hair on Grandpa. Underneath, I placed concise copies of the changes that directly affected them. School pickup authorization removed. Emergency caregiver permissions removed. Estate nomination updated. Trustee communication boundaries confirmed. I did not include every text. I did not include Carol's statement. I did not include my timeline. The box was not evidence. It was notice. That mattered to me. I did not want my daughter's gift contaminated by a trick. I wanted the order to remain honest. First, the thing Ava had made before they left her. Then the consequences of what they had chosen to do with that trust. Ava saw the box on the dining table after dinner. You put my card in there? Yes. Are Grandma and Grandpa getting it tomorrow? Yes. She smiled, relieved. Good. I didn't want them to think I forgot. I had to turn toward the sink for a second before I answered. They won't think that. The rest of the evening was strangely quiet. I checked the updated school confirmation once. I checked the attorney's draft once. I checked Monica's written acknowledgement once. Then I stopped. There was nothing left to discover before morning. That was the unfamiliar part. For days, every hour had produced another contradiction, another message, another sentence that changed what I thought I knew. Now the mystery was over. I knew what my parents had done. I knew the future they had been shaping. I knew what I had changed in response. The next problem would not be information. It would be whether I could hold the boundary when they were standing in my house again. At 9:17 that night, my phone buzzed on the counter. Mom, we dock tomorrow. We're coming over. The next morning, I woke before the alarm and knew immediately that the waiting was over. For 6 days, distance had protected me from one thing I had not wanted to admit I feared. Seeing my parents' faces and discovering that some old part of me still wanted them to tell me I was wrong. I could reject a text. I could end a phone call. I could read a trustee's notes and change a school form. Standing across from the people who had raised me was different. Family history lives in the body. It remembers who is allowed to be disappointed in whom. Ava was already awake when I went downstairs. She sat at the kitchen counter in pajamas, eating cereal slowly and watching cartoons with the volume low. The white gift box waited on the dining table. She glanced at it once and asked whether Grandma and Grandpa were coming after breakfast. I told her they were coming later, and that she did not have to see them unless she wanted to. She frowned at the idea as if I had offered her permission not to wear shoes in a grocery store. But they came back. The sentence carried no accusation. To Ava, returning still fixed something. I wanted to protect that part of her without lying to it. I asked what she wanted. She said she wanted to say hi, but did not want to talk about the bench again. I told her she would not have to. Carol had already agreed to take her across the street for part of the visit if she became uncomfortable. We made a simple plan Ava could understand. She could stay with me. She could go to Carol's. She could change her mind. Nobody would be angry with her for any of those choices. I repeated the last sentence twice because I had learned that saying something once did not undo years of learning the opposite. Around 10:30, Amanda texted that she and the kids were home. Mom and Dad were driving back from Port Canaveral. She said they had barely spoken to her during the drive from the ship to the parking garage. Then she added, "I think they're furious you talked to Monica." I stared at the message and almost laughed at the absurdity. My parents had left a 7-year-old alone on her birthday. Yet the unforgivable act in their minds was that I had asked an independent trustee questions about my own daughter's trust. I did not answer. At 11:06, Dad texted, 20 minutes. At 11:29, a silver SUV stopped in front of my house. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Dad got out first. He wore khaki shorts and a navy polo, the same kind of clothes he wore to casual family lunches. Mom came around the passenger side in white pants, sandals, and a light blue top. They looked rested in the irritating way people sometimes look after vacations, tanned at the edges, carrying more color in their faces than I had seen all week. Dad opened the back and pulled out 2 rolling suitcases. Mom carried a paper shopping bag, printed with bright tropical fish. The image was so ordinary, it became obscene. 5 days in the Bahamas had returned them to my driveway, with luggage and souvenirs. Ava's birthday cake had gone stale in my refrigerator. I opened the door before they knocked. Mom smiled immediately. Not a happy smile, a negotiation smile. There you are. Dad lifted one hand. Can we come in? I stepped aside because I had already decided the conversation would happen in my house, on terms I controlled. I had also decided Ava would not be used as the opening move. She was in the living room behind me, but when Mom took one step toward her with both arms extended, I moved slightly into the space between them. Ask her first. Mom stopped. Her face changed for half a second. Then she looked past me. Ava, sweetheart, can Grandma have a hug? Ava hesitated. That hesitation was so small, nobody who did not know her would have noticed it. Then she got off the couch and walked over. Mom hugged her too tightly. Dad put a hand on Ava's hair and told her they had missed her. Ava stood inside their affection, without giving it back in the effortless way she used to. I watched her shoulders. I watched her eyes. When she looked at me, I nodded toward Carol's house. You can go show Miss Carol your new bracelet if you want. Ava slipped away with visible relief. Mom's arms fell to her sides. She doesn't need to leave, Mom said. She wanted to. She's 7. She wants whatever you tell her to want right now. That was how quickly the reset attempt showed its shape. Dad put the suitcases near the wall and used the calm voice I had heard all my life. He said we were all exhausted, everybody had made assumptions, and there was no reason to make Ava carry adult conflict. On that last point, I agreed. He took my agreement as an opening and kept going. He said the family had survived worse than one terrible misunderstanding, and that what mattered now was restoring trust. The word almost made me angry enough to interrupt. I did not. Mom said she wished the sitter had shown up. She wished they had confirmed the handoff. She wished Carol had seen the message earlier. She wished I had been clearer before I left the country. Every regret she named contained a tiny exit for herself. Not once did she say, I wish I had not left Ava. Dad said they had helped me for years. They had rearranged schedules, picked Ava up, stayed overnight, stepped in every time work pulled me away. He said one bad decision should not erase the actual history of this family. I let him finish, then I asked, Are you done? Mom stared at me. Lauren, that tone is exactly why we wanted everyone to calm down before. I walked to the dining table and picked up the white box. The room changed when they saw it, maybe because it looked too ordinary, maybe because they recognized the yellow tissue paper tucked inside. Mom's expression softened first. Ava finished her present? Yes. I held the box out to them. For the first time since Carol called me, my parents looked uncertain. Dad took it because Mom did not. He set it on the coffee table. I sat in the chair opposite them. Mom lowered herself onto the couch beside him. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Open it, I said. Dad lifted the lid. Ava's card sat on top exactly where I had placed it. Thank you for always taking care of me. Purple stars, crooked red heart. 3 figures holding hands. Grandpa with bright blue hair. My father stopped moving. Mom leaned closer and made a small sound through her nose. She reached for the card before Dad did, and opened it. Inside, Ava had drawn a birthday cake with 7 candles and written Love Ava in letters that leaned uphill. On the back was a sticker from her school camp. Mom read the front again. Her face lost color. That was the first moment all morning when neither of them tried to explain anything. I thought about Ava carrying that card outside at 2 in the afternoon, moving it deeper into the shade so the tissue paper would not fade, going inside for water, and coming back, because Grandma had told her the sitter was coming, sitting under a porch light, after dark, with a thank you note for the people who had already boarded a ship. There are punishments you cannot arrange for another person. Sometimes the truth arrives in a child's handwriting and does the work by itself. Mom closed the card too quickly. This is cruel. I did not raise my voice. She made it before you left. I know when she made it. Then, you know I didn't write it. Dad stared at the picture a little longer. His jaw tightened. For a second, I saw something that might have been shame. Then habit returned. He put the card back into the box and noticed the papers beneath it. What are these? The changes I made while you were gone. He pulled out the first page. The school confirmation was simple. Diane Carter and William Carter were no longer authorized to pick Ava up or receive her in an emergency. The pediatric permissions were next. Then the notice that my estate plan had been updated, and neither of them nor Amanda remained my preferred standby guardian. Last was Monica's short acknowledgement that no relative had authority to act for Ava's trust without actual legal status and independent review. Dad's eyes moved faster as he read. Mom stopped reading after the second page. She moved from the school authorization to the medical permissions, and then the estate nomination, disbelief sharpening each question. I confirmed the changes and corrected her when she called the estate nomination guardianship documents. What struck me was her outrage that I had done it without consulting them. They're my documents. We are her grandparents. You were her caregivers on August 10th. Mom stood. We made a mistake. No, you made a plan. Dad's head came up sharply. Be careful. I felt something in me settle. For days, those words would have frightened me, because they implied I was about to cross some invisible family line. Now the line was behind us. I am being careful. I told them I had compared the timeline. The cruise was already booked when they accepted responsibility for Ava. No sitter existed, and every version of the supposed handoff had come through Mom, not me. I also knew both of them had asked Monica about support in another caregiver's household, and had already discussed Amanda taking Ava if something happened. I did not say more than that. I did not need a speech. Mom looked at Dad, not at me. That glance told me the list was accurate enough to worry them. Dad said my interpretation was reckless. He said asking financial questions did not prove they wanted custody. I agreed. Then he said discussing family contingencies did not prove they wanted Amanda to take Ava. I agreed again. He seemed confused that I was not fighting every sentence. Then what exactly are you accusing us of? He asked. Leaving my daughter after accepting responsibility for her, inventing a sitter I never arranged, and creating a story where the failure belonged to me. Mom's voice rose. We believed you had backup. Name her. Silence. Show me the message where I told you that. Mom shook her head. Not everything happens by text. Then tell me when I said it. Her mouth tightened. Dad stepped in and said, memory under stress was imperfect, which was almost funny, because the supposed conversation had happened before anyone had reason to be stressed. I looked at the box on the coffee table. That's why the access is gone. Mom's eyes filled. I had seen her cry before, but rarely when crying did not help her regain the room. You are taking her away from us. No. I'm stopping you from taking her anywhere without me saying yes. She insisted Ava loved them, that they had been there since Ethan died, and that they had done more than most grandparents. I agreed with every factual part of it. Each agreement made her angrier, because I would not give her an exaggerated accusation she could defeat. Finally, she pointed at the box. You put her card on top of legal papers, like some kind of punishment. I put her card on top, because it came first. That silenced her. Dad closed the box, then his voice changed. The warmth disappeared, but the volume stayed low. It was the voice he had used when negotiating contracts, correcting bank errors, or explaining to a service manager why a charge would not stand. You can revoke a pickup form. You can change a will. You cannot erase the fact that we have been the people keeping Ava's life stable while you travel." I looked at him. There it was. The next move. He continued carefully. He said teachers knew them. Neighbors knew them. Relatives knew how often Ava stayed with them. They had calendars, photos, messages, years of pickups and overnights. He said other people could see how much I depended on them even if I suddenly wanted to pretend otherwise. Mom wiped her eyes and found her footing again. "You're punishing the people who have actually been there." I thought about the bench. "I'm protecting the child you left." Dad's jaw moved. He said, "If you keep escalating this, you may not like who gets asked whether Ava is actually safe with a mother who keeps leaving the country." The threat was not loud. That made it worse. For 6 days, I had wondered whether I was imagining the legal edge behind their language. Now my father put it on the table beside Ava's card. Mom told him not to say it that way. He looked at her. "She needs to understand." I did. I understood more than he wanted me to. I said, "Are you threatening to take my daughter?" Dad shook his head. "We're saying there are systems for determining what is best for a child when adults can't agree." "You're not her parents." "No. We're the people who have been stepping in because her parent is gone so often." The sentence hit the exact bruise they had spent months pressing. For a moment I felt the old guilt flare. Frankfurt. 8 work trips. Delayed flights. My parents at school pickup. My mother braiding Ava's hair. Dad making breakfast. The true facts were all there. That was what made the threat dangerous. They did not need to invent my career. They only needed to give it a meaning. Then I remembered why they had all those caregiving records in the first place. Because I had trusted them. I stood. "This conversation is over." Mom stared at me. "You can't just end it because you don't like what Dad said. I'm ending it because you came here expecting to walk out with Ava, and now you're threatening me because I said no. We came to fix this. You came to restore access. That's the same thing." "No." I crossed to the front door and opened it. Dad did not move. "Think very carefully before you make this permanent." I looked at the gift box. "It became permanent when you put her on that bench." Mom flinched. For once, I did not make the sentence easier for her. They left the box on the coffee table at first. Dad picked up his keys. Mom walked to the door without looking at me. Then she stopped, turned around, and went back for the box. She held it against her chest. Not the notices. The whole box. Ava's card still inside. That image stayed with me long after the door closed. Carol brought Ava back 20 minutes later. She came in carrying a basil plant in a plastic grocery store pot and talking about how Miss Carol said plants could get dramatic if you watered them too much. She looked toward the living room immediately. "Did Grandma get my present?" I had prepared myself for that question and still had no good answer. "Yes." "Did she like it?" I looked at my daughter's face. She read every word. Ava smiled a little. Then she asked whether Grandma was still mad. I crouched, so we were eye level. Grandma's feelings are Grandma's job. Ava considered that, then held up the basil plant. "This one is my job. That one we can handle." She went to the kitchen to find a saucer. I stood there and wondered how many times I would have to tell her that adults were responsible for their own feelings before she believed it. My phone rang less than an hour later. "Amanda." She had already heard from Mom. "They said you ambushed them." I gave them the present Ava made and copies of changes that affect them. Amanda was quiet. Then she asked whether I had really removed her as guardian too. I said yes. She had known that already, but apparently hearing Mom describe it had made the consequence real again. "I'm not asking you to change it," she said. I waited. "They're saying you've lost perspective. That sounds familiar. They're also saying Dad talked to someone before they came over." My stomach tightened. "Who?" She said a lawyer. There it was. Not a new plan. The formal version of the old one. Amanda told me she did not know details. Mom had only said that if I refused to stop this nonsense, they had options. I thanked her and ended the call before fear could turn into speculation. Then I called the estate attorney, who had helped me update my documents, and asked for a referral to someone who actually handled Florida dependency cases. The lawyer returned my call that afternoon. I gave her facts, not theories. 7-year-old, overseas business travel, explicit childcare acceptance, parents left for a cruise, no sitter, neighbor found child. Existing child welfare record, parents threatening to challenge my fitness, and suggesting Amanda as the family alternative. She did not tell me I had nothing to worry about. I respected her for that. She explained that my parents could not simply declare themselves guardians because they disliked my work schedule. They could, however, make allegations to child protection or file a sworn dependency petition if they claimed to have facts showing neglect. A court would not automatically remove Ava because someone used the word neglect. There would be investigation, process, evidence, and a judge. Because Ava was currently safe with me, and I had changed the care structure, there was no reason from what I described to assume somebody would appear that night and take her away. My lungs loosened enough for me to breathe normally again. Then the lawyer added the part that mattered. A false or weak claim could still hurt. It could force me to defend my parenting. It could turn my travel history into exhibits. It could put Amanda's name into the case as a proposed relative placement if removal were ever considered. And because my parents had actually provided substantial childcare for years, their story would not look ridiculous on the first page. That was what they were counting on, not an instant victory. Accrédit l'accusation. I spent the rest of Saturday trying not to let that knowledge take over the house. Ava and I watered the basil. We threw away the stale birthday cake. She chose one slice to keep in the freezer, in case birthdays can have leftovers next year. And I let her because the sentence was too strange and hopeful to argue with. We ordered pizza and watched a movie on the couch. I kept my phone face down until bedtime. At 8:43, after Ava was upstairs brushing her teeth, an email arrived. The sender was a law firm in Orlando. The subject line contained my parents' names. My body knew before I opened it. It was not yet a filed petition. It was a formal demand letter from counsel, stating that Diane and William Carter had serious concerns about Ava's safety, that they believed I had repeatedly placed work travel ahead of consistent parental presence, and that August 10th demonstrated a failure to arrange reliable care. The letter said they were prepared to seek relief under Florida dependency law if I did not agree to restore regular access, participate in a family safety arrangement, and stop making what it called unsupported allegations of intentional endangerment. I read it once, then again. The language was polished. That did not make the facts better. Near the end was the sentence that told me the plan had not changed at all. If Ava were found unable to remain safely in my care, my parents intended to support placement with a suitable relative who already had a relationship with her, Amanda, the household they had been discussing before the birthday. I forwarded the letter to the lawyer. Then I went upstairs. Ava was in bed with the stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. She asked if Grandma had texted good night. No. Okay. She accepted the answer and closed her eyes. I sat beside her until her breathing slowed. For days, my parents had tried to make the story begin with my flight to Germany. Now they were preparing to put that version under oath. The allegation was simple enough to fit on one page. I was chronically absent. I relied heavily on my parents to raise my child, and on August 10th I left the country without arranging reliable care. If a court accepted that story, the family they had imagined for months had a name waiting for it. Amanda's. The demand letter did not change anything in the house that night. Ava still kicked one sock off in her sleep. The basil plant still leaned toward the kitchen window. My dishwasher still made the same ugly grinding sound near the end of the cycle. That was almost comforting. A lawyer could put the words chronic absence into a letter, but the next morning still began with cereal, a missing hair tie, and Ava asking whether Basil could get sunburned. I answered her, packed the documents my attorney had asked for, and tried not to let the possibility of a court case colonize every ordinary minute. My parents had already used my life as material. I was not going to help them turn Ava's home into a waiting room for litigation. The petition was filed 12 days later. I knew it was coming and still felt my stomach drop when my lawyer sent me the stamped copy. Diane and William had signed sworn allegations under Florida dependency law. They did not ask to become Ava's guardians. The filing was more careful than that. It said they were grandparents, with extensive first-hand knowledge of Ava's care, that they had provided substantial childcare for years, and that they believed my work travel had become incompatible with consistent parental supervision. It listed trips: Chicago, Boston, Minneapolis, Frankfurt. It listed overnights at their house, school pickups, delayed flights, dinners, medical appointments they had helped with, weekends when I had asked them to stay over because I was returning late. None of those events was invented. That was the first thing my lawyer told me to remember. Don't fight facts that are true just because you hate the story they're telling with them. I did not like hearing it. I needed to hear it. The filing treated August 10th as the point where a long pattern supposedly became dangerous. According to my parents, I had left the country after verbally telling them that my own sitter would take over at 2. They claimed they relied on that statement, left after the planned handoff time approached, and had no reason to believe Ava would remain unsupervised. The petition said the fact that no sitter arrived showed a failure in my childcare planning. It mentioned that I had immediately cut off grandparent access afterward, and characterized that decision as impulsive isolation of Ava from people who had historically provided stability. Near the end, it identified Amanda as a suitable relative placement if a court ever determined Ava could not safely remain with me. I read the petition 3 times, because anger kept changing the shape of the sentences. On the first pass, I wanted to argue with every word. On the second, I forced myself to circle only what was factually wrong. On the third, I underlined the things that were true, but being used to imply something else. Yes, my parents had watched Ava often. Yes, I had traveled. Yes, there were weeks when they did more pickup and dinner duty than most grandparents. Yes, Ava loved them. Yes, I had depended on them. What was not true was that dependence had been neglect. What was not true was that I created a sitter. What was not true was that they transferred responsibility to anyone before leaving. The child protection review that followed was less dramatic than my imagination had made it at 2 in the morning. Nobody arrived with police to remove Ava. Nobody treated the petition itself as proof. A worker met with me, confirmed Ava was home, reviewed the updated childcare plan, and asked practical questions about who would care for her if I traveled again. I answered them. I showed the new emergency contacts, and the fact that work travel was temporarily paused while I rebuilt the system. The worker spoke with Ava separately, in an age-appropriate way. I did not coach her. I did not tell her which details mattered. By then, I understood that trying to make a 7-year-old produce a perfect account would only repeat what the adults around her had already done, turn her into a tool. The immediate result was exactly what my lawyer had predicted. There was no present basis for emergency shelter removal. I was home. Ava was safe. There was a functioning care plan. The older incident still had to be examined, and the petition still had to move through the process. Relief and fear sat beside each other in me. My daughter was not being taken away that afternoon. My parenting was still going to be argued about by people who had taught her to sit outside waiting for an imaginary adult. The most difficult part was that my parents' case did not look ridiculous from a distance. Their exhibits included calendars, where their names appeared beside pickups, photos of Ava sleeping at their house, messages where I thanked them for helping, a text after a delayed Boston flight where I wrote, "I don't know what I'd do without you." Another from winter, when I asked Dad to take Ava to a dental appointment because a meeting had run long. There were family messages joking that Mom and Dad practically had joint custody already. Those jokes had been casual when they were made. Printed behind a sworn petition, they looked like something else. I sat in my lawyer's office, with those pages spread across the table, and understood why my father had sounded so confident in my living room. They had years of genuine caregiving history and months of comments about my travel, so they did not need to fabricate most of the raw material. Their strength was not that they had proof I was a bad mother. Their strength was that they had true evidence of being important caregivers and were asking a judge to accept the conclusion they attached to it. My lawyer asked me what our ordinary handoffs had looked like before August 10th. That question changed the direction of the room. I pulled up texts from prior trips. When Mom took Ava after school, we confirmed the date. When Dad covered an overnight because my connection was delayed, there were messages about dinner, bedtime, when I would land, and when I would pick Ava up. If someone else took over, the handoff was named. There were addresses, times, sometimes far too many details because that was how I operated. Even my mother usually confirmed changes in writing when the schedule actually changed. The alleged 2:00 sitter transfer on Ava's birthday was the exception to every normal pattern my parents themselves had documented. That did not automatically win anything. My lawyer was careful about that too. A judge could believe a verbal conversation happened. People changed plans by phone. Families did things informally. The fact that I could not find a record of a sitter did not prove, by itself, that my parents had invented one. The case would turn heavily on credibility, sequence, and whether the claim against me was more likely true than not. My anger about motive would matter only if it could be tied to things that existed before the conflict blew up. So we stopped talking about what I believed was in my parents' heads and reduced the case to the sequence already preserved. They had accepted care in writing after the cruise was booked. Diane had told Amanda and Ava that I arranged someone else. At 2:06, she told Carol my sitter was late. Yet no sitter, booking, payment, message, confirmation, or actual handoff existed. The line anchoring responsibility remained the same. Leave her with us. We've got her. If Mom and Dad wanted the court to believe I regularly depended on them because they were Ava's reliable caregivers, then they were asking the court to recognize a pattern in which everyone, including them, understood they had real responsibility when they agreed to take her. If they wanted the court to believe responsibility on August 10th somehow disappeared, they had to explain the one handoff that existed nowhere except their memory. Their own history did not erase my vulnerability. It created theirs. I wish I could say seeing that contradiction made me feel safe. It did not. Legal danger is strange, because a strong argument does not stop the fear that someone else may believe the weaker one. I still woke before dawn and checked that Ava was in bed. I still felt a shock of guilt when an email from work mentioned a future European meeting. I still heard Dad's phrase, "her parent is gone," so often at moments when nothing had prompted it. The difference was that I no longer treated the feeling as evidence. Amanda became the next pressure point. She called 3 days after the petition was filed and told me my parents' lawyer had contacted her about a sworn declaration. They wanted a written account of what she knew before the cruise. On its face, that was reasonable. Amanda had been there. She knew Mom and Dad planned to sail. She knew they had watched Ava that morning. She knew what Mom told her about a sitter. She also knew about the earlier conversations concerning stability and the possibility of Ava living with her. "What are you going to say?" I asked. "I don't know yet." The answer angered me, but I made myself wait. Amanda explained that the formal questions were not the part bothering her. The lawyer had asked for facts. Mom and Dad were doing something else. They were calling her separately and pressing her to make it clear that I had personally told everyone about the 2:00 sitter. Amanda had never heard that from me. The only person who told her I arranged a sitter was our mother. Did you tell them that? Yes. And? Amanda gave a humorless laugh. Mom said I'm being technical. I closed my eyes. Technical. As if the source of the central allegation were a minor detail. Amanda said Dad told her nobody was asking her to lie. He said they only needed her to explain the understanding before the cruise that the family believed I had changed the plan. Amanda pointed out that she could honestly say Diane told her I changed the plan. She could not honestly say I told her. Dad responded that drawing that distinction would make them all look confused and would give my lawyer room to twist things. For once, Amanda recognized the request before agreeing to it. She had not decided what to do next. That was the part that hurt. Some part of me wanted truth to have become easy for her after the birthday. It had not. My parents still helped with Mason and Peyton. Dad still covered occasional expenses. Mom still did after-school pickup when Amanda's hours ran late. The cruise had ended, but the practical dependence had not. If Amanda contradicted them in a sworn statement, she was not only choosing between versions of one day, she was risking the support structure, keeping her own household balanced. I'm not going to tell you what to say, I told her. She was quiet. I mean it. I need you to say exactly what happened, even the parts that make me angry at you. You mean the cruise? I mean all of it. You knew they were supposed to have Ava that morning. You wanted to go. Mom said it was handled. You didn't ask me. You knew they had talked about Ava maybe living with you someday. You knew they'd mentioned her money covering her share. Say all of it if you're asked. Amanda breathed out slowly. Even if it hurts you? If it's true, yes. That answer cost me something. It meant giving up the fantasy of a perfect defense, built only from flattering facts. Amanda's testimony could help my parents establish exactly what I did not deny. They had provided a lot of care. Family members saw me as dependent on them. Amanda had once thought Ava might live with her if something happened to me. But I had spent too much time watching my mother manufacture clean stories from messy facts. I was not going to win by becoming better at the same thing. A week later, my lawyer showed me a background summary my parents had submitted. They tried to frame their pre-birthday questions about another relative household as responsible contingency planning. Standing alone, that explanation was possible. The problem was timing. Those trust, support questions, the conversations about Amanda taking Ava, and Mom's warnings about my work all predated the birthday. They did not prove theft or intent by themselves, but they showed that the future my parents now called a response had already been contemplated. The same contradiction kept surfacing. My parents wanted credit for being experienced caregivers while denying responsibility at the one moment care became dangerous. They wanted Amanda treated as the safer relative, while relying on a handoff story no one had heard from me. Their version held only as long as Carol, Amanda, and I stayed inside separate versions of the same day. The system began to fail when we compared notes. 2 evenings before the next scheduled court date, Dad called me directly. My lawyer had already told me I did not have to take private calls about the case. I almost let it go to voicemail. Then I answered because I wanted to hear whether he was still pretending this was about safety. He did not yell. He said the legal process was getting expensive and ugly, and that none of us needed to let strangers decide how our family worked. He said he and Mom were prepared to withdraw the petition if I agreed to restore regular contact with Ava, stop telling people they had staged the birthday incident, and work out a written family care arrangement that included them. For a few seconds, I could see exactly why people accept bad peace. The case would go away. No hearing. No more worker visits. No more invoices from lawyers. No more wondering whether a judge would believe a verbal conversation that never happened. Ava could have her grandparents back in some recognizable form. Amanda could stop standing between two versions of the family. I could go back to work without court dates on my calendar. All I had to do was let the people who used access to manufacture danger regain the access they had lost and agree not to name what I believed they had done. Dad called it compromise. I heard the condition underneath it. Silence in exchange for peace. It was the same lesson Ava had followed on the bench. Do not make trouble. Wait. The adults will decide when things are normal again. No, I said. My father went quiet. I told him if they believed their sworn allegations were true, they could let the process test them. If they did not believe them, they could withdraw without asking me to surrender anything in return. I would not buy back family peace with my daughter's safety. His voice chilled. He said I was making a mistake. Maybe I was. That was the terrifying part of choosing a boundary before you know how expensive it will become. But the fear did not change the decision. I'll see you through counsel, I said, and ended the call. I sat in the dark kitchen afterward, with the refrigerator light leaking from under the door, and felt sick. Agency did not feel powerful. It felt like refusing the easiest exit, while every nervous system in my body begged me to take it. My phone buzzed 10 minutes later. Amanda, I answered. She was crying quietly enough that I almost did not recognize it. She said Mom had called her again. Then Dad. Then Mom once more. They wanted the declaration finished before the hearing. They wanted the wording clean. They wanted her to say that before the cruise. I had personally told her I arranged the sitter for 2. Amanda took a shaky breath. Lauren, she said, they want me to repeat something Mom told me that you never said. For the first time since this started, the next decision was not mine. Amanda did not tell me what she was going to do that night. I did not ask again. That was the hardest kind of restraint for me. Because every part of the case had trained me to believe that safety came from knowing the next move before anyone else made it. But this choice belonged to my sister. I could tell her what the truth had cost Ava. I could tell her what a false statement might cost me. I could not make honesty honest by ordering her to perform it. So I told her only one thing before we hung up. Whatever you say, make sure it's yours. Then I went upstairs, checked on Ava, and tried to sleep. The adjudicatory hearing came 3 weeks later in a Florida circuit courtroom that looked much smaller than the place my fear had built in my head. There was no jury, no crowd waiting to gasp, no row of reporters. Just a judge, lawyers, court staff, the people whose names had been repeated through months of messages, and the quiet mechanical sounds of paper being moved from one place to another. Ava was not sitting beside me. My lawyer had made sure her involvement stayed as limited and age-appropriate as possible, and I was grateful. I had spent enough time watching adults turn her birthday into evidence. She did not need to watch them argue over what kind of mother I was. My parents sat across the room with their lawyer. Mom wore navy and kept her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles looked pale. Dad looked almost exactly as he had in my living room after opening the gift. Controlled, upright, determined to make reasonableness look like innocence. Amanda sat farther back. She had not called me the night before. She had sent one text that said only, "I'll be there." I did not know whether that meant she would help me, help them, or simply stop hiding from what she knew. The legal question was narrower than the family war that had grown around it. My parents had alleged neglect and asked the court to adjudicate Ava dependent. They had the burden. They had to make their version more likely than not. Ava had remained with me the entire time because there had been no finding that she faced present imminent danger in my care. I had kept working. School had started. The basil plant had somehow survived. Life had continued while the case waited for a courtroom. My parents' story sounded strongest when it stayed broad. They had cared for Ava often after Ethan died. I traveled for work. They had picked her up from school, taken her to appointments, kept her overnight, fed her dinner, covered delayed flights, and stepped into the gaps a widowed working parent sometimes needed help filling. They had calendars and messages to prove it. Their lawyer did not have to exaggerate that part. He simply arranged the true facts into a shape that suggested something had been sliding for a long time, and August 10th was the day it finally became unsafe. Then the story had to become specific. On August 10th, they said, their responsibility ended because I had verbally told them my sitter would take over at 2. That was the hinge. Everything turned on whether that handoff had actually happened. Carol testified before I did. She looked uncomfortable in the witness chair. Not frightened exactly, but irritated by the idea that ordinary neighborliness had brought her into a courtroom. She did what she had promised from the beginning. She stayed inside what she personally knew. She said she left her home before 2 that afternoon and did not return until close to midnight. She did not see Ava sitting outside all day. She did not see my parents leave. She did not know what any of us intended. She described coming home, seeing my porch light on, noticing Ava on the bench with the yellow gift bag, crossing the street, and finding no adult in my house. She described bringing Ava inside and calling me. When asked about the 2 o'clock time, Carol was precise. Ava had told her grandma said she had to wait there because a sitter was coming. Carol did not claim more. Then the 2:06 message was put in front of her. Lauren's sitter seems late. If you see Ava out front, call Lauren for me. Carol identified my mother's number and the unread message on her phone. She explained that she had not seen it until she returned that night. My parents' lawyer tried to make the message sound helpful. Maybe Diane had simply been concerned. Maybe she believed a sitter was late and reached out to a nearby adult. Carol did not argue with him. She just said, "She never asked me to go get Ava." That sentence was not dramatic. It was factual. It landed harder because Carol did not try to tell the judge what it meant. When it was my turn, I did not hide Frankfurt. I gave the court my travel dates, my work purpose, and the child care arrangement I believed I had when I left. My lawyer introduced the full conversation around the message that had become the spine of my defense. I had told Mom I was considering declining the trip because it overlapped Ava's birthday. Diane had answered, "Leave her with us. We've got her." Dad had followed with his own confirmation and plans for the day. I admitted exactly how much I had relied on them before that. I admitted there had been delayed flights, overnights, school pickups, appointments. I did not pretend the grandparents sitting across from me had been strangers to my daughter's life. That was the point. They knew how our handoffs worked. My lawyer walked through earlier examples from the same records my parents had submitted. A Chicago trip where Mom confirmed pickup time by text. A delayed Boston flight where Dad confirmed Ava would sleep at their house. A dental appointment where I sent the time and office address, even though Dad had been there before. A weekend when another sitter took over after my parents, and the sitter's name, phone number, arrival time, and confirmation were all in the message thread. Again and again, the documents my parents had offered to prove how much I depended on them also proved something else. When responsibility actually moved from one adult to another, we confirmed it. August 10th was the only supposed handoff with no name. No booking. No payment. No message. No call record showing me changing the plan. No adult who said she had agreed to come. No confirmation that anybody had arrived before my parents drove toward Port Canaveral. My mother still insisted the conversation happened verbally. She could not say exactly when. My father said he understood from Diane that the plan had changed and that they both believed my sitter would take over. Under questioning, he also acknowledged that he never spoke to the sitter, never saw the sitter, and never confirmed an adult had entered my house before they left. The same man who had submitted months of records to show how deeply involved he was in Ava's care now had to explain why, on her 7th birthday, he accepted an unnamed transfer he had not witnessed and left anyway. Their evidence did not disappear. It turned around. The more reliable they claimed to have been, the less believable their carelessness looked as a normal family handoff. The more experience they claimed with my systems, the stranger it became that the one change carrying the greatest risk existed only as a vague memory. The more they insisted they knew Ava's routines better than almost anyone, the harder it was to explain why they left a 7-year-old waiting for a person neither of them could identify. I had spent weeks being afraid of the phrase they practically raised her. In that courtroom, I finally understood the limit of it. If they wanted credit for being caregivers, they had to own what caregivers were responsible for. Amanda was called after a break. I watched her walk forward and thought about every version of my sister I had carried through the story. The favorite, the selfish one, the beneficiary, the woman smiling in a cruise photo while my daughter sat on a bench. The sister who admitted she wanted the vacation badly enough not to ask one more question. None of those versions was false. None was complete. My parents looked at her when she sat down. Amanda looked at the judge. Her testimony began with things that did not help me. She admitted Mom and Dad had complained about my travel for months. She admitted she had sometimes thought I relied on them too much. She admitted Mom had asked whether she could take Ava if something happened to me, and that she had said yes. She admitted she knew about Ava's trust, and had heard Mom say Ava's money could cover Ava's share if Ava ever lived with her. Then she admitted the cruise. She said she knew our parents were supposed to be caring for Ava that morning. She knew they were also joining her at Port Canaveral. Diane told her I had arranged another caregiver for the afternoon. Amanda did not call me to confirm it because she wanted the trip to go forward. My chest tightened when she said that, even though she had told me before. Truth does not become painless just because you approve of telling it. Then came the question my parents had been preparing her for. Had I personally told Amanda that I arranged a sitter for two? Amanda paused. Mom's head lifted. Dad did not move. No, Amanda said. Lauren never told me that. My mother closed her eyes. Amanda continued before anyone could reshape the answer. Diane had told her I arranged someone. Diane had told her the plan changed. Amanda believed Diane. That was the source. My parents' lawyer asked whether the family generally believed I had backup. Amanda said she could only speak for herself. She believed there was backup because Mom said there was. He asked whether she thought her parents would knowingly leave Ava with nobody. Amanda looked down for a second. Before August 10th, I would have said no. The room stayed quiet. That was all she gave him. No accusation that she had watched them plan it. No claim that she knew their minds. No heroic rewrite that made her innocent. She kept her own failure inside the testimony and refused to carry theirs. The bridge my parents needed was gone. They could still claim I told them about a sitter, but they could no longer point to Amanda as someone who had heard the change from me. Ava had heard it from Diane. Carol had heard it from Diane. Amanda had heard it from Diane. The alleged plan kept traveling outward from my mother without ever passing through me. The earlier stability conversations mattered differently after that. The court heard enough to understand the timing. My parents had been talking about my travel before the birthday. They had asked Amanda whether Ava could live with her if something happened. They had asked Monica administrative questions about qualifying child expenses in another caregiver's household. William had asked practical questions about housing, school transportation, and childcare. None of that gave them the trust. None of it meant Amanda could receive Ava's money for herself. Monica's role remained independent, and nobody suggested otherwise. But those conversations existed before the incident they later used to justify concern. That timing mattered. So did the thing my parents had tried hardest, to separate from themselves. They had already booked the cruise when they told me to leave Ava with them. Their lawyer argued that families plan contingencies. He was right. He argued that asking about a trust did not prove misconduct. He was right about that too. He argued that working parents can misunderstand handoffs. Also true. My lawyer did not need to prove every hypothetical impossible. She needed to show that my parents had not proven neglect by me. By the end, the case had become much simpler than the months leading to it. I had traveled for work after confirming care with experienced family caregivers. Those caregivers left without verifying another adult had taken over. The replacement caregiver they attributed to me could not be identified because she did not exist. The only contemporaneous message about that supposed sitter came from Diane, 6 minutes after Ava had been instructed to wait outside, and it asked a neighbor to call me if she saw my child. My parents wanted the court to treat my distance as the dangerous act. The record kept returning to their departure. The judge did not give a speech about betrayal. She did not call anyone monsters. She reviewed the allegations, the evidence, the credibility problems, and the burden that had to be met. The court declined to adjudicate Ava dependent on the allegations against me. There was no order removing her. There was no Amanda placement. Ava remained where she had been throughout the case with me. I heard the ruling and did not feel triumphant at first. My shoulders dropped. That was it. No applause, no performance, just my body finally stopping its brace for someone to tell me I had to hand my daughter over. The proceeding did not restore my parents' old access. It did not make them school contacts again. It did not put them back into my estate plan or give them a role in Ava's trust. It also did not send them to prison or erase that they were her grandparents. The deputy's report and child welfare record remained what they had always been. Documentation that Ava was found without an adult caregiver after my parents left. The court had tested the story they tried to build around me and refused to turn it into the outcome they wanted. Outside the courtroom, Amanda stood near the wall with her purse held against her stomach. Mom walked past her without speaking. Dad stopped. For 1 second, I thought he was going to blame Amanda. Instead, he looked at me. We were only trying to keep the family together. The words were tired now, stripped of the authority they used to carry. I could have listed every contradiction again. I could have told him family did not require dependency petitions or imaginary sitters. I could have asked whether keeping the family together had included leaving Ava outside in August heat. Weeks earlier, I would have needed to win every sentence. I did not anymore. The family you wanted required Ava to become evidence, I said. Dad looked away. That was the end of the conversation. My mother did not speak to me that day. Amanda did, but not until we reached the parking lot. She told me Mom had already said she would no longer be doing after-school pickup for Mason and Peyton. Dad had told her he was done financing disrespect. Amanda's face was pale when she said it. The cost she had feared had arrived almost immediately. I did not offer money. That was harder than it sounds. The old version of me would have stepped in because I was the sister who could handle things. I would have turned her honesty into another problem I had to solve, then called it generosity. Instead, I told her I was sorry it hurt and that I hoped she figured out what came next. She nodded. For the first time, neither of us asked our parents to translate the other. When I picked Ava up later, she was at Carol's kitchen table drawing a plant with a face. She knew there had been a court date. She knew grown-ups had been deciding whether something bad had happened because of me. I had kept the explanation simple because 7-year-olds do not need procedural law to understand whether home is still home. She looked up when I came in. Are we done? With court? Yes. Do I still live with you? I had to swallow before I answered. Yes, you still live with me. She nodded, as if I had confirmed school was open tomorrow. Then she went back to her drawing. Carol gave me a look over Ava's head, one that said she understood how much that ordinary answer had cost. On the drive home, Ava watched familiar streets slide past the window. When we turned onto ours, she looked toward the porch. The bench was still there under the overhang. I had not moved it. I had not wanted to make a piece of furniture into something powerful enough to control our house. Ava was quiet after we parked. I thought she was tired. Then she asked, Grandma and Grandpa can't pick me up now, right? Not unless I say so. And Aunt Amanda isn't my backup? Not right now. She rubbed one thumb over the edge of her seatbelt. Miss, Carol is. Yes. And you have the other people on the paper. Yes. She thought for a while. The legal danger was over. The house was ours. The plan my parents had spent months building had failed. They had lost the access they assumed was permanent, the credibility they expected their caregiver history to buy, and the path that placed Ava in Amanda's household while leaving them at the center of family decisions. But listening to my daughter count adults like emergency exits, I understood the part no judge could decide for us. I had won the question of where Ava would live. I had not yet answered the question the bench had taught her to ask. She looked at me and said, "If I need someone, who do I call now?" The answer I gave Ava in the driveway sounded almost too simple after everything it had taken to get there. "You call me first." She looked at me, still rubbing her thumb along the edge of the seatbelt. I told her that if I was not there, she went to the adult whose name we had confirmed together, Miss Carroll, if she was home, her teacher, or the school office if she was at school. The sitter I had personally introduced to her, if we had agreed that sitter was responsible. If anyone ever told her the plan had changed, and she had not heard that change from me, she was allowed to ask questions. She was allowed to ask to call me. She was allowed to go to another trusted adult. And if she felt unsafe, she did not have to worry about being polite. "You do not have to sit and wait because you're afraid somebody will be mad," I said. Ava listened with the serious expression she usually saved for instructions involving glue or baking. Then she asked, "Even if they said they're coming?" I swallowed. Even then, we did not fix the lesson of the bench in one conversation. I had spent too many years teaching Ava, without meaning to, that being easy was something to be proud of. The opposite lesson had to become just as ordinary. It had to show up when nobody was frightened, when there was no courtroom, no neighbor calling near midnight, no adult trying to decide what family meant. It had to live in breakfast and backpacks and small problems that could have been ignored. The first weeks after the hearing were quieter than I expected. My parents did not apologize in any complete way. Mom sent 2 messages saying she hoped I was satisfied with how far this had gone. Dad sent one telling me that courts could resolve petitions, but could not repair families. I did not answer either message immediately. Before August, silence from me would have meant I was waiting for the right words to make everyone comfortable. Now it meant I was deciding whether a response was useful. Most of the time, it was not. Their practical role in Ava's life remained exactly where I had put it. They were not authorized to pick her up from school. They were not emergency caregivers. They had no medical permission and no informal route into Ava's trust. They were not the default people I called when work ran late. The court had not ordered those boundaries for me. I had. That distinction mattered because it meant I could not blame a judge if holding them became inconvenient. I had chosen them because access without trust was no longer acceptable. For a while, there was no contact at all. Ava asked about Grandma and Grandpa, less often than I feared, and more often than I wanted. Sometimes she missed them. Sometimes she was angry. Sometimes she asked whether they were still on a cruise, even though she knew they had been home for weeks. Children circled difficult facts instead of walking straight through them. I stopped trying to correct every feeling. If she said she missed Grandma's pancakes, I did not remind her what happened on her birthday. If she said she did not want Grandpa to pick her up, I did not tell her she was being brave. I told her both things could be true. She could love somebody and still need different rules with them. Amanda's life changed more visibly. Mom stopped after-school pickup for Mason and Peyton, just as she had threatened. Dad stopped covering the little expenses that had been keeping Amanda's budget from tipping over. There was no dramatic eviction or collapse. My sister did what millions of people do when help disappears. She rearranged. She traded shifts when she could, used school aftercare more often, cut things that were optional, and learned which months had no room for surprises. She complained to me once about the price of aftercare, stopped halfway through and said, "I'm not asking you to pay for it." "I know," I said. There was a time I would have offered anyway, not because she deserved it or did not deserve it, but because solving other people's problems was how I proved I was the daughter who needed nothing. I would have turned Amanda's decision to tell the truth into another obligation I carried. This time I let her carry the cost of her own life. I listened when she wanted to talk. I did not rescue her financially. She did not ask me to. Our relationship became less warm in some ways and more honest in others. We stopped using Mom as the place where information went before reaching each other. If Amanda heard something about me, she called me. If I needed to know whether she had agreed to something involving Ava, I asked her directly. Some conversations were awkward. Some ended quickly. We were not suddenly best friends because she had told the truth in court. She had still chosen convenience on the day of the cruise. I had still removed her from my guardian plan. Neither fact disappeared. But we stopped pretending that family closeness required inaccurate stories. The work of rebuilding childcare was much less dramatic than dismantling the old system, which was exactly what I wanted. I interviewed sitters, instead of treating whoever was available as automatically trustworthy. I checked references. I used written confirmations for handoffs even when the arrangement felt obvious. Carol remained one local emergency contact, but I made sure she was a backup, not an invisible substitute expected to save a bad plan. The longtime family friend I had added to my estate planning knew the role I was asking her to consider and understood that it was a contingency, not present authority. Ava knew the difference too. I made an emergency card for her backpack. It had my number, Carol's number, the school office, and simple instructions written in language a 7-year-old could understand. We went through it without turning the exercise into a reenactment of her birthday. I did not make her sit on the porch and pretend nobody came. I did not quiz her until she gave me the answer I wanted. We practiced ordinary situations. If the adult who is supposed to pick you up is not there, what do? If someone says Mom changed the plan, what do you ask? If your stomach feels wrong about something, who can you tell? At first, Ava answered every question like a student trying to pass a test. That worried me. I wanted her to know safety, not perform it. So I stopped asking for perfect answers and started letting the system prove itself. The first time a sitter arrived for an evening work event, I introduced them again at the door, even though Ava had already met her. I said the sitter's name, when I would be home, and who the backup was. The sitter repeated the plan. Ava heard all 3 adults agree on the same reality. When I returned, I came when I said I would. A month later, work asked whether I was ready for an overnight trip. My first instinct was still no. The word formed in my mouth before I checked the actual facts. Ava was doing well in school. The care plan had worked several times. I had a vetted sitter, Carol as backup, and a written handoff that did not depend on a family member, remembering what someone supposedly said. I also had a daughter who needed to see that safety did not require me to stay within 10 feet of her forever. So I took a short domestic trip. The night before I left, Ava helped me put the itinerary on the refrigerator. She knew who would pick her up, where she would sleep, when I would call, and what she could do if any part changed. She did not cry when I left. I made myself not praise her for that. Instead, I said, "If you miss me, tell me. If you need something, tell the sitter. You do not get extra points for keeping it to yourself." She rolled her eyes in the exaggerated way she had recently discovered and said, "I know, Mom." That eye roll felt healthier than obedience had ever looked. The trip went fine. I called when I promised. The sitter confirmed every handoff. Carol never had to step in. When I got home, Ava ran toward me with a story about a classmate who had accidentally glued 2 worksheets together and had apparently become the funniest person in 2nd grade because of it. There was no crisis, which was the point. Several months later, after the system had worked enough times to become boring, I accepted another international supplier trip. I did not treat boarding the plane like an act of courage. I treated it like a professional obligation supported by a childcare plan I understood. And Ava understood too. My parents did not disappear from the story, but they stopped controlling its shape. After several weeks, Ava asked if she could see them. I told her yes, under rules that made sense. The first visit was short and took place with me present. No pickup, no overnight, no private conversation about the case, no promises about when things would go back to normal. Mom looked wounded by the boundaries. Dad looked embarrassed by them. I let both feelings belong to them. The visit itself was almost painfully ordinary. Mom brought a small container of cookies. Dad asked Ava about school. Ava showed them a drawing of the basil plant, which by then had survived long enough to become woody and unattractive. Nobody talked about the trust. Nobody talked about Frankfurt. Nobody said the word dependent. I had told my parents before the visit that if they tried to explain the birthday to Ava in a way that blamed me or made her responsible for forgiving them, the visit would end. They did not test that boundary. Near the end, Ava asked a question I had not expected. "Do you still have my birthday card?" Mom's face changed immediately. Dad looked down at his hands. "Yes," Mom said. "Where?" She swallowed. "At home, on the refrigerator." Ava smiled as if she had been told a school project was still on display. "The one with Grandpa's blue hair?" Dad gave a small nod. "That one." Nothing about the moment felt like forgiveness. My mother did not suddenly confess everything she had done. My father did not become a different man because he had kept a piece of construction paper. But I understood what the card had become in their house. They could tell themselves they had been trying to protect Ava. They could tell themselves the legal case had been a reasonable response. They could tell themselves I had overreacted. The card gave them nowhere to put the child they had actually left. "Thank you for always taking care of me." Written before the cruise. Carried to the bench. Kept after the court case failed. They had chosen to preserve the one object that contradicted every excuse without accusing them of anything. When the visit ended, Mom asked when they could see Ava again. I told her I would decide based on how Ava was doing and whether the boundaries continued to be respected. She started to argue that grandparents needed consistency. Then she stopped herself. It was a small change, not a transformation. I did not reward it with access she had not earned. I simply noticed that for once, she had heard no before trying to turn it into negotiation. Ava's healing was harder to measure because it happened in smaller places. She still waited too long sometimes. One morning I found her struggling with a zipper on her backpack after I had already told her twice we needed to leave. She had been working at it silently for several minutes, cheeks red with frustration. When I asked why she did not call me, she said, "You were making coffee." Another afternoon, she came home with a worksheet she had not understood but had been too embarrassed to ask her teacher about because everybody else was already doing it. None of those moments looked connected to a porch bench. They were exactly connected to it. I changed my language before I tried to change hers. I stopped calling her my easy girl. I stopped saying, "You never give me any trouble," as if trouble were the opposite of love. When she told me she needed help, even with something she probably could have solved alone, I tried not to answer with, "You can do it." Sometimes she could. That was not the point. The point was that asking did not need to be punished with a lesson in self-sufficiency every time. I started saying, "I'm glad you told me." The first few times, she looked suspicious. Then she started using me for things I had not realized she had been carrying. A bad dream. A friendship problem at school. A spelling word she kept getting wrong. A sting enning any wa. Enning any wive. Any was to mention. Because she thought it might go away. None of those things required dramatic parenting. They required availability. Sometimes the answer was a hug. Sometimes water. Sometimes a conversation. Sometimes telling her she still had to do the hard thing, just not alone. By winter, the front porch bench had become ordinary again, without either of us deciding that it should. At first, Ava walked past it quickly. Then one afternoon after school, she dropped her backpack on it while she hunted for a library book. A few weeks later, she sat there to retie her shoe while I brought groceries in. I noticed both times and said nothing. The real change came on a cool Saturday when we were outside trimming the dead parts off the basil plant before moving it to a bigger pot. Ava carried the empty pot toward the porch and sat down on the bench because her arms were tired. I sat beside her. The light was bright but not harsh, and there were children riding bikes farther down the street. Carol was watering something across the road. Ava leaned against my arm for maybe 30 seconds, then asked whether basil could become a tree if we kept it alive long enough. I don't think so, I said. That's disappointing. She stood, picked up the pot, and went inside. That was all. She had sat on the bench and left when she wanted to. Nobody told her where to be. Nobody told her to stay visible. Nobody was supposed to find her. I did not take a picture. I did not tell her the moment meant something. Some places stop being frightening not because you defeat them, but because enough ordinary life happens there afterward. 6 months after her birthday, our family looked less complete from the outside and more honest from the inside. My parents were still her grandparents, but they were bounded relatives, not authorities woven through every system. Amanda and I still irritated each other. She had adjusted to less help from Mom and Dad, and never again spoke about Ava's trust as something connected to her household. We talked directly. Sometimes that was all progress looked like. I was still an operations director. I still traveled. I still occasionally missed dinner because a meeting ran long, and I still felt the old guilt flare when I packed a suitcase. The difference was that guilt no longer got to define the facts. I did not prove I was a good mother by becoming a woman who never left the house. I tried to prove it by making sure leaving never meant Ava was left without a real plan, a real adult, and a real way to ask for help. I could not guarantee that nobody would ever fail her again. That promise would have been another kind of lie. What I could teach her was that being failed did not require silence, waiting, or earning love by needing less. One February evening, I was at the dining table finishing a supplier report while Ava worked on a school project in the living room. I could hear scissors opening and closing, paper sliding across the floor, and the occasional frustrated sigh she had inherited from me. A year earlier, I would have let the silence tell me she was fine. 6 months earlier, she would have kept struggling until I noticed. This time, footsteps came down the hall. Ava stopped beside my chair, holding a piece of cardboard with one corner bent the wrong way. She did not apologize for interrupting. She did not tell me she had already tried everything. She did not wait for me to look up first. "Mom, I need help." I closed my laptop before she had to ask twice, turned all the way toward her and said, "Of course, show me."